So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube. Dapper Dinosaur here. Recently, I've become interested in what the people in the pews in Creationist churches are learning. That's why I did a series on Carl Kirby. But I also want to see what people in smaller, less affluent churches are hearing. This is because, while responding to the PhD and professional creationists is awesome, and I have no plan to stop doing that, they're making arguments that I'm not sure are filtering down to the creationists on the street, if you will. This talk is from a church called Calvary Chapel. It's not actually far from me, at about 3 hours drive. It's in the beautiful Arizona highlands, about equidistant from the Navajo Nation, Fort Apache Reservation, and Phoenix. If you think of Arizona as just a bunch of sun-scorched rock and cacti, then go visit the highlands. They're full of lakes, pine trees, deer, and wonderful campgrounds. Just don't speed there, because those roads are on cliffs and it's a long way down. Anyway, this is presumably a sermon called 8 Ways Science Verifies Biblical Creation as Superior to Secular Science, and this is from October 11th, 2020, given by Pete Greer. Pete Greer is associated with the Foundation Ministry and has a master's from Northern Arizona University in physical education with a biology minor, and he also seems to have taken some graduate courses in biology. Although, as we'll see, it seemed not to seep in. Anyway, take it away, Pete.
I'm just trying to give you an overview of the biblical view of that science verifies the biblical view.
I know I harp on this a lot, but this is not the biblical view with a capital T. It's a biblical view, sure. But it's a minority view, and the fact that other people disagree with Pete doesn't mean they aren't serious about their religion or the Bible. People can honestly look at the text of Genesis and interpret its meaning and intent differently. And not to go all postmodern on y'all, but when people do that, it's hard to say one of them is objectively right and the other wrong. Now, in terms of the science, that's easier, but here we're just talking about what you think the Bible actually says about things like creation. After this, there's a quick prayer. I'm cutting it out because I have no response to it. I also cut out some autobiographical details.
But the reason I like to share this information is because I believe that our culture has been held captive by a theory that has no scientific credence.
It's got nearly 100% scientific credence, but I think he may have meant credibility, which it also has a lot of. But I can see why someone who doesn't believe in an idea would say that it lacks credibility. It's almost necessary to think that those things you think are incorrect are incredible, in the literal sense. Now, I'm going to give something as a useful heuristic. There is simply too much to know for any one person to be an expert in more than a handful of things, and if you want to rise to the level of a well-informed layperson, you are still going to have to restrict that to a limited number of areas. For example, I am quite ill-informed about sports ball, Chinese history, algal systematics, etc., etc. So what do we do when something we don't know becomes important? Well, we go to people who do know what they're talking about. The people who have dedicated their time and energy to become experts. So when you need medical advice, you go to a doctor. And if you're in doubt about the diagnosis or advice you get, you go to a different doctor to get a second opinion. The more opinions from experts you get that all agree, the more confidence you have in that conclusion. Now, does that logically make this opinion right? No, it doesn't. But experts that reach a consensus generally do so for a good reason. And if you lack expertise, your best bet is to assume that they are at least largely correct. This remains true in biology. Essentially, all the experts agree that evolution is the only theory of biodiversity and the only model that explains the patterns we see in morphology, genetics, and the fossil record. And a person without expertise is unlikely to be able to overturn that paradigm.
I'll be discussing that later, but our scriptures tell us, beware lest any man cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ.
Let's pull back from that verse and read a bit more context. This is the English Standard Version of Colossians 2, 6-10.
Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him, who is the head of all rule and authority.
At this point, the author goes on about how Jesus is the Savior, and then gets to this bit in verses 16-19.
Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism, and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God.
This section of Colossians is about maintaining a high Christology in the face of people who might say that Jesus was not fully divine, as well as telling the Colossians not to worry about the details of Mosaic dietary laws and fasting rules. It's certainly not a warning that you must adhere to a literal interpretation of Genesis.
And that's exactly what the theory of evolution has done. It's a philosophy, it's deceitful.
Evolution is a scientific theory. It's not capable of deceit, because deceit is a willful attempt to deceive a person or persons. Proponents of evolution might be deceitful, but evolution cannot be. It's not really a philosophy, it's a scientific theory explaining the patterns of biodiversity we see now and in the past. Now, sure, it rests, as does all science, on certain aspects of philosophy of science, but it's no more a philosophy than the theory of general relativity is.
And it's according to the tradition of men, and it's not according to Christ.
Well, it was certainly created by humans, and none of those humans were Jesus, near as I can tell. But like I said, that's also true of other theories, like the germ theory of disease. Nowhere in the biblical text can we get a clear idea that infectious diseases are caused by microbes, and that killing such microbes can prevent or cure disease. But despite this, most Christians will still take antibiotics to cure their strep throat.
So I want to come against that today. I want to come to you and speak the words of truth so that you can have full confidence in the Word of God. Did you know that 70% of our youth from evangelical Christian homes are leaving the church when they go to high school and college? 70%.
Maybe you should stop telling them that to stay Christians, they have to believe obvious nonsense like anti-evolution claptrap. Just a thought.
And I believe one of the reasons is we haven't trained them in this area, because they go to school, they go to their science classes, and they get called idiots for believing in the fairy tales that are in the Bible.
Couple things. First, they absolutely should not be called idiots for this. If anyone is doing that, it is not okay, especially if it's school staff doing it. Kids in school accept what they have been taught by and large, at least until they get to some higher education, where they will start to begin to really do the work of verifying things on their own. A kid who has been taught anti-science nonsense isn't stupid, he or she is ignorant, and that's important. Second, I have the opposite take, because I have talked to too many people who realized that the professional creationists were lying to them, and that caused them to embark on a journey that ended with them abandoning Christianity altogether. Not always religion, but Christianity at least. In fact, of the former young earth creationists I know, some of whom were extremely well versed in the creationist literature, former Christians outnumber Christians considerably. Now, I know both myself and Pete here are using anecdotal evidence, but I would love to see a study on this, and based on what I've heard about polls of young people leaving the church, the science is a big part of it for a lot of them. And obstinately being wrong about it isn't doing the churches any favor.
I must mention that Dr. Rick Oliver...
So Dr. Rick Oliver is yet another scientist who reconverted to Christianity for reasons not related to being convinced of young earth creationism, then decided to change his mind about evolution. His testimony is linked in the description. He even starts out by dismissing the importance of evidence. Once you decide that evidence doesn't matter, you're no longer doing science.
I traveled with him for 3.5 months in 2010. He's got a PhD in evolutionary biology. He got that because he wanted to prove his mom wrong about the Bible.
That's certainly not the introduction he gave, and according to himself, for years he was a jerk to Christians and gave them bad grades. So it's not like he got his PhD and realized how stupid evolution was. It seems more like he decided it was stupid after deciding evidence was not important.
And he travels the country teaching creation science now. He was actually flying into that area right there. That's Mount St. Helens. He was flying in there on a helicopter to relieve a person on that post that was reading the seismograph and everything when the mountain blew. And he's got a great testimony. His website will be up there at the end where you can go there and see his teachings. It was an awesome thing, but he verified all the things I had been learning for 7 years up to that point. He verified it, so I can feel confident I'm teaching you the truth both biblically and what's happening in the real world in science.
Having a man who self-admittedly doesn't care about evidence teach you is about the same as just not being taught. Maybe I'll do something on Rick Oliver. If you like that, let me know in the comments.
So this is a jail cell I took a picture of on that trip. It's in a park in Wilsey, Kansas. And the thought occurred to me, you know, when you're in that jail cell, you know you're in that jail cell. There's no doubt about it. You're not getting out of that jail cell. But There's so many people in our culture that have been taken captive by this theory of evolution that they think is disproven the Bible, and they don't even know that they're being held captive.
It's almost like if you base your theology on the idea that a literal interpretation of Genesis must be true, that when people learn it's not, they then have to decide that your religion is nonsense too. Pete doesn't have to go down that route, but I guess he just really wants to be wrong.
And I'm going to show you today how that belief and the fact that they close their eyes to any opposing viewpoint and just call it unscientific, out of hand, how that's wrong, how that hurts their research, how it hurts them on their outlook towards their science that they're doing. There's a war of the worldviews in our culture. There's God's word.
And demonstrably true physical reality. I'm sure that's what he's about to say next.
And there's man's word.
Yeah, humans didn't make up the universe. And while they did invent science, it doesn't depend on their ideas to be useful. Science works. It makes predictions which can be and are confirmed. This includes evolutionary biology. It's not man's word in any sense other than the description of what is evident in nature. If God didn't want us to believe in evolution, he shouldn't have arranged everything so that it either does not contradict or actively supports the theory.
Materialism, evolution, naturalism all fall under that category.
Well, evolution is only naturalistic and materialistic in the sense that it concerns the natural and material world. It doesn't require one to be philosophically naturalistic or materialistic. And that's true of all theories in science. Science is about the natural and material world. But you can be a supernaturalist and still accept and do good science.
We have this battle, and it seems to be over the evidence. You know, some people think it's over the evidence. We say it's for creation. No, they say it's for evolution. But the truth of the matter is we all have the same evidence.
I'm here going to refer my audience to the book The Rocks Were There by my friends Jackson Wheat and R.J. Downard. It is an 825-page tome that is expected to be part one of at least two, with the second part being of comparable size. And essentially the whole thing is a catalog of creationists ignoring evidence that they don't like. Creationists notoriously ignore huge swaths of the data that they find inconvenient. Let me give an example. I'll turn to a random page on The Rocks Were There. Page 200 starts with an examination of creationist takes on Lenski's long-term E. coli experiments. It notes 52 sources relevant to creationist claims that are simply ignored by creationists, and notes that they rely on only 13 sources, of which several were not actually peer-reviewed, but published in creationist rags, and those that were not were often mischaracterized. This is not an isolated problem. In another work, Evolution Slam Dunk, author R.J. Downard goes through the stunning amount of ignored data on the evolution of mammals from basal synapsids, in which creationists barely even touch on the evidence, and even when they do, they ignore almost all of it. In fact, Downard has calculated that, at a rough estimate, creationists tend to exclude 90% or more of the relevant data at any time when they bother to touch on any scientific subject. It's not that we have the same evidence, it's that science has the evidence and creationists just pretend that almost all of it doesn't exist, focusing just on the bits that they find easiest to spin. If you're interested in either book, links are in the description.
The layers at the Grand Canyon are the layers of the Grand Canyon for both sides. They're there. We look at them. We use our worldview to interpret them. So they interpret it as a lot of time and a little bit of water.
More like a lot of time and a lot of water. Remember, many layers of the Grand Canyon are marine, meaning they were under the ocean. That's a lot of water.
And I interpret it, and the Bible interprets it, a lot of water and a little bit of time through the flood of Noah.
The Bible doesn't mention anything about geology at all, except I guess for the bare existence of things like mountains. Because the authors of the Bible didn't really know anything about geology. Because basically no one did until the modern period. Sure, people realized that here and there volcanoes caused new rock or that earthquakes could shift rock, but there was no real idea about sedimentation, lithification, the rock cycle, etc. until well into the modern period. In fact, even a passing knowledge of geology reveals that a global flood cannot be responsible for the geology of Earth, which includes things like aeolian sandstone, subaerial tuff, and evaporites, none of which can form under a flood. But further, it includes things like hundreds of meter thick limestone and coral layers, which take longer to form than young Earth creationists think the Earth has been around. And that's under optimum deposition conditions.
So the same evidence is there, and so what we want to learn to do is look at it from a biblical worldview. Creation scientists and evolutionists both use operational science. The scientific method is the same. Doesn't matter what your presuppositional position is, we still do the laboratory science the same.
Let's check on that. First, let's go to Andrew Snelling, a man I've called the most dishonest creationist I know of. You see, he's Answers in Genesis' pet apologist, and he is the main source for their claim that the rocks from the Paleozoic and Mesozoic are all flood rocks, but the Precambrian and Cenozoic rocks are not. So pre-flood and post-flood respectively. But then, in order to show the necessity of floods to make fossils, he will present Precambrian and Cenozoic fossils. Also, and perhaps more seriously, he will describe folded sediments as lacking fractures, but then to evidence this, he will use low-res pictures of folded rock strata with people standing in front of the largest fractures. That's not the same science as secular geologists use, as can be seen from high-resolution, sharply focused images from the US Geological Survey, which flatly contradict this claim. Or how about we turn to Steve Austin, who sent multiple samples to a lab in Boston, where he knew, because it was on their website, that they could not meaningfully date his samples. And when he got his samples back with ages of about 200,000 years, the minimum age the lab could return, he crowed about it as if measuring a grain of rice on a truck scale that gives a minimum weight of 1 ton would somehow solve world hunger because each grain of rice weighs a ton. And then the one date that he got back that was beyond the minimum the lab could return was in the one sample with visible crystals in his own paper that are consistent with xenocrysts, which are older crystals in volcanic rock that, if included in a dating attempt, will skew the age old. What did Austin do to show that these were not xenocrysts? Basically just said, trust me, bro. That's not how science is done. It is blatantly dishonest in both cases and disqualifies it from being science. And I should note that neither of these things depend on our assumptions about the history of the world. Both these men deliberately did bad work designed to get to the conclusion they wanted regardless of how old the Earth is or how biodiversity came about. And of course, if you want to keep seeing me take things like that apart, do make sure you like this video, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Now, after that ham-fisted segue, let's get back to Pete Greer.
We test it, we collect data, we report it, we have peers review what we find to see if it looks good or not, and both sides do that.
The problem is that creationist peer review doesn't really exist. There's a hollow mockery of peer review, but not actual peer review. For one thing, creationist so-called journals will refuse to publish findings that contradict their predetermined conclusions. Right there, that's enough to remove them from the category of peer-reviewed journal, because peer review isn't about whether you agree with the conclusion of the paper, it's about whether the work was good as far as the peer reviewer can tell, even if the conclusion is wrong or the reviewer doesn't agree with it. Next, the review and editorial staff of these journals is woefully inadequate. For example, as far as I can find, their Answers research journal, the supposedly scholarly publication of AIG, has as its only editor Andrew Snelling, and as an example of the lack of integrity there, they still have, to this day, as far as I know, not published any retraction of a work by Dr. Tompkins on human chimp DNA, despite the result being wrong because of high school level math errors by Tompkins, as pointed out by Glenn Williamson, who submitted a correction. That correction has been metaphorically sitting on Snelling's desk for years now, neither rejected nor published. Creationists are doing science the way science is done on Star Trek, for pretend and just to serve a narrative.
Where we differ is on the historical science, when we look back in the past, because both creation and the beginnings of life and the earth for evolution happened before man was there to observe it.
Well, since according to a literal take on Genesis, humans are the last creation God seems to make, that's not a difference, that's a commonality.
And so we have to rely on historical science, gather evidence, try to interpret it the best that we can to see which view has the most veracity. And I believe you'll see today that our creation science has a lot of truth to it.
I do like that Pete isn't just dismissing the idea that science can effectively investigate the past. That is not always the case, and I wonder if it is because he is not connected to one of the big organizations, which typically say that scientific investigation of past events is essentially entirely dependent on untestable presuppositions, and can't really be trusted. Of course, they don't tend to extend this to things like forensic science and criminal investigations, but, oh well, creationism has never been completely consistent.
So these are the 8 topics. I'm not going to go over them. We're going to go through them one by one, but I want to restate that each of these are an individual talk that we're just going to hit the highlights of this morning. I want to get people's interest who have never gone there and heard this before.
Awesome, that's what I'm looking for. An overview of what a young Earth churchgoer will get during a sermon on the topic.
For those of you who have been here for years and you've heard the expanded talks, this is a review for you, okay? So get it fresh in your minds. And for anybody who's never heard this before, please just listen with an open mind and weigh what you hear. So the first one is the biblical concept of one kind or family of living organisms can only reproduce other members of that kind.
Ah, the most used word in creationism that's never been given a useful definition. As most of my viewers know, there's no way to know if anything has crossed the boundary into another kind, because those boundaries were never defined, so this is meaningless.
All right? This is found in Genesis chapter 1, that everything reproduces after its own kind. So, what do dogs have when they have babies? And everybody from 3 years old and up or less will tell me they have puppies, which are dogs.
Okay, but in addition to being members of Canis lupus familiaris, they're members of the wider species, C. lupus, which includes the gray wolf, the Arctic wolf, etc. Additionally, they're part of the genus Canis, which includes animals like C. latrans, the coyote, C. aureus, the golden jackal, and C. lupaster, the African wolf. But also, they're part of the subfamily Caninae, which also includes other genera such as Lycaon, Vulpes, Nycteriutis, and Chrysocyon. But they're also in the family Canidae, that includes now extinct animals like the Borophagine or bone-crushing dogs. But they're also in the superfamily Canoidea, and the infraorder Cynoidea, and the suborder Caniforma, and the order Carnivora, which falls into the clades Carnivoriformes and Carnivoromorpha. But they also fall into the clade Pancarnivora, which itself is part of Ferae, which lumps in pangolins with dogs. But from there we get to Pharynculata, which also includes horses. Then we get to Lorisitheria, which includes hedgehogs. And from there, Loricitherians are also in Boreoeutheria, which includes humans and mice. And Boreoeutheria is in Eutheria, which includes elephants. And Eutheria is in Theria, which includes kangaroos. And Eutheria is in Mammalia, which also includes the platypus. And Mammalia also includes a bunch of fossil things you've never heard of. But Mammalia is in Mammaliformes, with organisms like Morganucodon, and Mammaliformes is in Mammalomorpha, with things like Adelobacillus. And Mammalomorpha is inside Probanignathia, with Probanignathus, which is in Cynodontia, with animals like Triacodon, and Cynodontia is in Therapsida, with animals like Mostrops and Gorgonops. And that's in Sphenacodontia, which includes things like Edaphosaurus and Dimetrodon. And Sphenacodontia is in Synapsida, which also includes things like Archaeorhynthus. But Synapsida is in Amniota with birds, and Amniota is in Tetrapoda with salamanders, and Tetrapoda is in Stegocephalia with Tiktaalik, and Stegocephalia is in Rhipidistia with the lungfish, and Rhipidistia is within Sarcopterygii with the coelacanths, and Sarcopterygii is within Osteichthyes with the carp, and Osteichthyes is in Gnathostomata with the shark, and that's within Vertebrata with the lamprey, and that's within Chordata with the tunicate, and Chordata is within Deuterostomia with the starfish, and Deuterostomia is within Nephrozoa with the squid, and Nephrozoa is within Bilateria with the flatworm, and Bilateria is within Eumetazoa with the jellyfish, and Eumetazoa is within Metazoa, which includes sponges, and Metazoa is within Holozoa, which includes the single-celled choanoflagellates, and Holozoa is in Opisthokonta, along with mushrooms, and Opisthokonta is within Eukarya, along with pine trees, and only at this point does the tree of life start to get tangled going back in time. And the same ways that we put dog into a subspecies of the gray wolf is the same way we put all organisms into all higher classifications. The task of creationism is to show where we went wrong, where, no, the higher classification is not an objective fact of ancestry, but simply an arbitrary human convention. And by the way, I left out dozens of clades, both named and unnamed, which have been discovered by science. Mostly because they didn't have members that most people would recognize that I hadn't already named.
Well, dogs do change. We have many different varieties of dogs. All the varieties of dogs today came from probably one wolf-like pair that came off the ark.
Nope. There is too much diversity within just the wolf alone, let alone the whole genus Canis, to be explained from one breeding pair coming off the ark.
And through natural and artificial selection, we've come up with all different kinds, not kinds, but species, man's named them species of dogs.
I'm curious to see if he keeps the kind at the genus level, or if he moves it up to the family level like most creationists. And
we've even got it where we've bred out so much information that we ended up with a Chihuahua.
There is no objective way to measure information in an organism that results in a Chihuahua having less information than some other dog. I mean, the implication seems to be that being small means you have less information. So do the Baka people of Central Africa have less information than the Dutch? I mean, the Baka have the shortest average height of known people groups, and the Dutch the highest. Somehow, I don't think Pete would be okay with saying that the Baka have had information bred out of them, while the Dutch maintain much more information from Adam and Eve. But that's the implication of saying that the Chihuahua has low information compared to a wolf, since the Chihuahua has all the same bones and organs as a wolf, and even has more muscles in its face than a wolf. Now, if there's a reason for saying that other than size, I'd love to know, but it's the only obvious difference between Chihuahuas and other members of the genus Canis that I see.
It's a dog, but it's almost a mouse.
Well, since it's no more like a mouse than it is like a chimpanzee, I'm going to have to assume that this is confirmation that yes, we are talking about size. And also, by what other metric could we say that a mouse has less information than a wolf? I don't know. I guess just gross size correlates with information, so blue whales must have the most information, despite the fact that the largest known genome belongs to an amoeba, which must have very little information because it's small.
But it will never be a mouse. It'll always be a dog. It can never be anything besides a dog because that's the genetics that God gave it.
Okay, but evolution also precludes a dog from becoming a mouse, even if it occupies the same niche as a mouse. It can become mouse-like superficially, but you can't cross over into another group in evolution. You can only start new groups within older, larger groups. This is called monophyly. You can't escape your ancestry. And since both mice and dogs have ancestry that's independent at about the level of Boreoeutheria, they can't become each other. It would be like your sister becoming your third cousin. Assuming no inbreeding, that just is not how it works.
And we've never seen an example of that being violated yet in observational science.
Yes, and if we saw that, it would violate both evolutionary biology and creationism. So no one expects to see that.
So if evolution is true, we should find transitional creatures. I'm going to show you some fictional ones. But guess what? They're just as accurate as the ones that were in my biology book when I taught biology in the high school.
Except transitional species exist. Just to remind ourselves, let's see some.
All those are just man's conjecture. They find a bone here and they find a bone there, and then they draw this picture connecting the two, and they teach it to the students as a fact.
Okay, let's look at some examples of in situ fossils of transitional forms, such as Elpistostega, Tiktaalik, Archaeopteryx, and Adelatherium. Notice how these aren't bones scattered miles away, but are obviously associated and in some cases even in articulation. Fossil species, both obviously transitional and not, are not composed of bones scattered all over the place, and therefore likely to be chimerical. Now that's not to say a bone is never misidentified as being part of a particular individual when it wasn't, but that's also something that's checked for, as in the case of that one vertebral element in Lucy that turns out not to have been hers.
Say, if you don't believe that, you're ignorant. It's just man's idea.
Again, but look at the Berlin specimen of Archaeopteryx and tell me that that whole animal is just some human invention.
It's not backed up. Nobody observed this one becoming that one, right?
Yes, and no one has observed a redwood seed growing into a 126-meter tall behemoth. But we have seen all the stages in between, and we have well understood mechanisms for how it happens, so it's a pretty safe bet that Hyperion, the tallest known tree in the world, started at some point as a seed, and a fairly small one at that.
Observation is what real science is. So these are made up, so what we'll never find a bird dog.
Yes, that would violate the rules of evolution. It's good to see that we're going full crocoduck. Evolution precludes the natural occurrences of transitions between separate extant lineages. Instead, the ancestors of any two organisms wouldn't be the same organism as either of them. In this case, the most common ancestor of a bird and a dog would be the first amniote population, and they would have looked a bit like lizards, although they wouldn't actually be lizards, as lizards also have numerous specializations, but those to the human eye would not likely be very noticeable from the outside. I'm going to skip over his series of crocoduck analogs, including the cow dog, the tiger bunny, the tiger cow, the zebra kangaroo, and the butterfly cat. It's just different photoshopped animals, some well done, that makes the same point I addressed. Good to know that young Earth creationists in the pews are getting such rigorous strawmen.
Chimpanzees, what do they produce? Well, they produce other chimpanzees. We're supposed to have a common ancestor with that thing, according to evolution.
Yes, they're more genetically similar to humans than tigers are to lions, despite the fact that most creationists argue that lions and tigers share common ancestry. And they're even in the same genus, Panthera.
So bacteria are some of the simplest known life on the Earth. That's what some scientists say became the first living organism.
Bacteria may well be the simplest form of life that you can find on Earth today, but they are probably much more complex than the simplest form of life possible. Further, I don't know of anyone in origin of life research who thinks that they represent the likely form of the first life on Earth. Remember, Earth life has been around for somewhere around 4 billion years, and bacteria, if anything, evolved more quickly than eukaryotes, given their rapid reproduction. So bacteria have done a lot of evolving since the origin of life.
How did it become alive and all those other questions? They can't answer it.
Abiogenesis is very much an open subject, and I am not one well versed in it. And I'm lucky if I can correctly identify a benzene ring. But here's the thing. The fact that there still is active research in the field doesn't mean that the thing being researched isn't real or didn't happen. Nor does it mean that our only explanation is miracles. Despite what some religiously motivated outsiders to the origin of life research might tell you, the field is progressing, and researchers in it are not exactly despairing of potential mechanisms for going from abiotic chemistry to life.
But they say that became alive. Darwin thought it was a very simple thing.
What bacteria? The origin of life? This isn't a science point. This is a basic use of pronouns thing. If your antecedent isn't clear, then you shouldn't use a pronoun.
If he knew how complex it was, he may have never gone where he went, but he didn't know that. He thought it was very simple. So he said that we started off there, and through many different changes over time, it became a man.
Darwin never really went into the origin of life in much detail, although yes, he did think that cells were simpler than we now know them to be. But evolution predicts that complexity should arise through time, not so much because complexity is favorable, but because when you start with minimal complexity, as is likely the case for the first life, there's really only one way to go. But again, we're kind of conflating the origin of life with the evolution of subsequent life. Nothing about the complexity of bacteria precludes the evolution of humans. I'm not even sure what the argument is.
Okay, so we've studied bacteria because we want to see them become something else, because that would kind of prove evolution.
No, it absolutely would not. It would disconfirm one of the major aspects of evolution, monophyly. If bacteria ever evolved into something that wasn't bacteria, that would mean that they left behind their ancestry, something which is logically impossible. In evolution, new groups arise within old groups, so you can get new varieties of bacteria, but you can't get them to become not bacteria. Similarly, in organisms you're probably more familiar with, when mammals evolved into primates, they didn't stop being mammals, and when primates evolved into monkeys, they didn't stop being primates, and when monkeys evolved into apes, they didn't stop being monkeys, and when apes evolved into humans, they stayed mammalian, primate, monkey, apes. It's like a branching tree. No branch can ever grow so much that it is no longer connected to the trunk. But it can grow new branches. But again, those branches are still connected to the trunk.
So Lenski, this is a famous experiment where he studied 58,000 generations of E. coli bacteria. He bottled evolution. That's what it says. He bottled evolution. This is what he came up with. 12 replicate populations. Well, what's a replicate population? A replicate population of dogs would be a collie, a German shepherd, whatever the other kind of dog is your favorite, fill it in. So he found E. coli bacteria that looked a little bit different from these different ones, just like we all look a little bit different.
No, Lenski didn't find 12 different populations. He explicitly founded 12 populations that were clones of each other. This is all over the literature that he has published on the long-term experiment. Differences between the populations are the direct result of evolution within each lineage, not initial differences. I'll just read this quick bit of introduction from Lenski et al. 1991, a published paper some 3 or so years after the start of the experiment, and that is linked in the description. It's from the American Naturalist, Volume 138, Number 6, and I found it on the University of Chicago website. Quote, "In this first article, we examine experimentally the process of adaptation and divergence in the simplest possible case. Replicated populations that are founded from a common ancestral clone and then propagated in parallel in a well-defined environment." So the experiment is already mischaracterized at the outset. This does not bode well.
He found some that look a little bit different, so he called them 12 replicate populations and called it evolution.
Nope, he got 12 identical populations and then watched them evolve. I mean, it's right in the paper I cited. This is just wrong. I don't know enough about Pete here to say if he's being ignorant or dishonest, but either way, this is not acceptable from someone who's trying to critique basically all of life science at the very least. In order to critique an idea, you have to know what the idea is. You can't critique Christianity by pointing out that there's no evidence for a hollow earth, simply because that isn't really something that Christians as a whole believe or argue for. Similarly, if you're going to critique an experiment that shows evolution, you can't just pretend that the experiment wasn't what it was.
He saw natural selection and adaptation. We see that, that's true.
He also saw an entire new metabolic pathway evolve, causing some of his populations to no longer meet the standard definition for Escherichia coli. But even if he didn't, adaptation and natural selection are themselves evolution. Evolution is a change in allele frequency in a population over time at a minimum. And let's not forget that this experiment wasn't done to prove evolution. It started in 1988. We were already about 60 years past the need to prove the basics of evolution as we now understand it. Evolution was already the only theory of biodiversity and biological change over time that was in the running. There was no need to try to prove it in 1988. The experiment was meant to demonstrate various mechanisms and elucidate various points within evolutionary biology, such as the importance of historical contingency.
That's scientific. We observe it happening. He never saw the bacteria become anything else, and it didn't even turn into a different type of bacteria.
Well, I repeat myself, but evolution precludes E. coli from becoming something that isn't bacteria. But yes, in fact, the strains called CIT+ are in fact a different kind of bacterium. One of the key ways that E. coli are diagnosed as such is that they are incapable of digesting citrate in an aerobic environment. The CIT+ strains, through a series of mutations, now have evolved the ability to do just that, meaning that they no longer meet the definition of E. coli. So far, the only thing Pete has gotten right about this experiment is that it was started by Lenski and his team, and that it involved 12 strains.
It was still E. coli. They still named them all E. coli. So
if we started calling some of them Fred, would that mean that Mr. Greer here would say that this experiment now shows evolution? Somehow I doubt it, but the fact is that some strains no longer meet the classical definition of E. coli, and if they were found in the wild, they would get a new name.
really, I should be able to just stop there, but I can't. Okay, let's keep going.
What? He should be able to stop after getting every relevant detail of the Lenski long-term E. coli experiment wrong? No, he shouldn't. He should have to go back and get it right, but that's not going to happen.
So here's another real simple thing. We're told that fossils are millions and millions and millions of years old. So according to evolution, which means change, evolution means change, we should see some huge differences, right? Well, there's the turtles, the fossil and the real turtle. We should see minor differences. Adaptation does occur.
But what about animals like Papochelys, Eorhynchochelys, or Odontochelys? These are exactly what we'd expect to see of proto-turtles. Seems like quite a bit of evolution. But I'm sure when you cherry-pick fossils, you can find some that you don't need to bother to make a citation for, that look a whole lot like modern animals. But bring in the whole data field, and suddenly a very different picture is established.
And then we see wolf spiders. They look like the ones we have today.
Okay, but what about Adarcopus? You know, the spider that still has a tail like a whip scorpion? You know, the kind of thing you'd expect if our ideas about the evolution of arachnids are correct, and that does show considerable evidence for the morphological evolution of spiders.
And then we see starfish. Yep, still look the same.
Okay, but what about Tenoimbricata, a bilateral echinoderm? You know, the kind of thing you'd expect to see if our ideas about evolution of sea stars are correct, and that does show considerable evidence for the morphological evolution of echinoderms.
Bats, 50 million years ago, and then today, yep, pretty much the same.
Okay, but what about Onchonycteris, a primitive bat with no adaptations for echolocation, and that still has claws on all of its wing digits? You know, the kind of thing you'd expect to see if our ideas about evolution of chiropterans are correct. And that does show considerable evidence for the morphological evolution of chiropterans.
Crabs, yeah, pretty much the same.
I don't even know where to start with this one. There are at least 5 independent lineages of crustacean that have all evolved into crabs or rather crab-like forms. Each has their own independent fossil lineage. Just look into, quote, carcinization.
Shrimp.
So shrimp are members of the family Caridae, and while the origins of the group are not well preserved, we have huge numbers of species that look very little like modern shrimp you'll find at the market. Organisms like Antrimpos, with its uniformly wide pleopods and weirdly long legs.
Dragonflies.
What about Meganeura, a late Carboniferous odonate that is neither a dragonfly nor a damselfly, but still retains primitive features like obvious cerci? You know, the kind of thing you'd expect to see if our ideas about the evolution of dragonflies were correct, and that does show considerable evidence for morphological evolution of dragonflies.
Horseshoe crabs.
What about Lunataspis, a late Ordovician xiphosuran that doesn't have the division of segments into 3 tagmata, the cephalon, abdomen, and telson. Instead of having a cephalon, non-tagmatized abdominal segments, and a telson. You know, the kind of thing we'd expect to see if our ideas about the evolution of the horseshoe crab are correct, and that does show considerable evidence for the morphological evolution of the horseshoe crab.
I've read in some books that they say horseshoe crabs could be 1 to 2 billion years old.
Bullshit. Okay, I'm pretty confident he's just lying. Animals didn't evolve until about 800 million years ago, and horseshoe crabs sure as are animals. The oldest member known of the order Xiphosaura, the order to which horseshoe crabs belong, is from the late Carboniferous, while the oldest Limulids, which is the family to which the modern horseshoe crab belong, is from the early Carboniferous. I will lay it on the line that he did not read that in any book. He's making it up.
Some scientists believe that, not all. Okay?
I bet he can't fucking name one that think that the god horseshoe crab are 2 billion years old. What the hell would they have eaten? They eat sedentary animals and decaying animals and plants. You know, things that didn't exist 2 billion years ago.
But this is one of the first, things that could move about and so forth. And so there's 1 to 2 billion years of change for you.
Not even close. The first things that could move about on their own were things like Dickinsonia, which isn't even a true bilaterian, never mind an actual chelicerate arthropod, something that wouldn't even begin to evolve until the later Cambrian, as opposed to the Ediacaran, where we find Dickinsonia. And of course, as stated, the fossil record for Xiphosaura goes only back to the Carboniferous. That means we have to get through the Ediacaran, the Cambrian, the Devonian, and the Silurian in order to just get to the first things we might call horseshoe crabs, which were not even modern horseshoe crabs. That's tens of millions of years of stuff moving about. Pete Greer is just making this up, or he's getting it from some bullshit artist who he can't be bothered to fact check. Both lying and sloth are sins, Pete.
There's the seahorse, fossil in today.
So I did a video about this already with Jackson Wheat. Here's a link to it in the upper right-hand corner of the video. But to sum it up, seahorses evolved so recently that we still have all the transitional forms leading up to them today, in the form of other members of their family, Cygnathidae, namely the pipefish, sea dragons, etc. Fun times. Also, since creationists tend to put the kind at the family level, then the seahorse evolved from non-seahorse pipefish-like ancestors in the creation model too. Way to be internally consistent, creationists.
This one has a story because they looked at that and they saw those big fins on that fossil, and they said, well, it lived in the warm, shallow ocean, and it moved those fins, and it crawled up on land and learned how to breathe air, and it became an amphibian, okay?
Wrong on all counts. Most fossil coelacanths are freshwater, not saltwater fish. They are not particularly close to the ancestors of all tetrapods. That's the stegocephalians. And we don't know if they could breathe air or not, although it's possible.
Well, in the 1950s, I believe, somebody went to a market in Indonesia and saw coelacanths for sale in the fish market.
Yeah, so what? Although I should note that the modern coelacanth, Latimeria, is unknown in the fossil record. We only have distant relations.
And they said, well, where'd you get that? And they said, well, everybody here gets it. We just go out there and we put our nest down and we get them. They said, show us where it is. So they did. They took them out there and we saw real live coelacanths still swimming around using, in the very deep part of the ocean, by the way, and using their fins for what fish use their fins for.
Again, yes. And hey, want to know why this deep water marine lineage doesn't really have much of a fossil record? Oh, it's because deep water marine animals don't last that long and have a poor fossil record overall.
It's part of a class of fish called the lobe-finned fishes.
Yep, or to be a bit more technical, Sarcopterygian. And along with the coelacanth, it also includes the South American and African lungfish and tetrapods, who are stegocephalians, along with forms like Eusthenopteron.
So they took that lobe-finned fish, they found the fossil, they made a story up on it.
Nope. The first coelacanth was described and named by Louis Agassiz in 1839. The group had been known from fossils for more than a century. They didn't need to go find a fossil now that they had living examples.
And they tell you that you just don't know what's going on if you don't believe their story.
What story? That coelacanths are found in the fossil record? I mean, they are. We've known that for almost 200 years now.
So we'll never see the birdfish.
Well, birds are already fish, but they're not hybrids between ray-finned and lobe-finned fish. They're highly derived lobe-finned fish. So, no, you won't see anything like that absurd straw man he flashed up on his TV.
So where is the evolution in all of that? We see natural selection and adaptation, but we don't see anything changing into something else.
What is meant by something else? Because we see speciation happen, both in the lab and in the wild. So unless Pete here is going to be way more specific about what we should see but don't if evolution be true, then he's just taking a long time to say nothing.
This is an interesting quote. Everybody knows that organisms get better as they evolve. They get more advanced, more modern, and less primitive. And everybody knows that organisms get more complex as they evolve. The only trouble with what everybody knows is that there is no evidence that it is true.
Oh, look, a good old-fashioned quote mine. So if Pete is using this honestly, then it means that Dan McShay is implying that there is some fundamental problem with evolution as an explanation for the origin of biodiversity. Well, let's read the next two paragraphs, shall we? Quote, "At one level, of course, it must be true. We really are more complex than the first cell, and we're not alone. Anyone can see that the first organism on this planet was simpler than the modern reptile or beetle or whatever," says McShay. But that proves very little. The first organism was almost certainly the simplest organism, which means that in terms of complexity, there was initially no place for life to go but up. The interesting question is what happened later. Did natural selection drive organisms onward and steadily upwards towards ever greater complexity because being more complex improves their chances of survival? Researchers have always assumed the answer was yes, but lately McShay and a few other researchers have been trying to test that unshakable assumption with real data. And the data tell a different story. Evolution does not necessarily drive life towards greater complexity. As organisms evolve, they are just as likely to shed complexity as to gain it, at least insofar as biologists can measure it. End quote. Huh. Weird how that isn't what the article is talking about. It's about whether there is an overall tendency to increase complexity which is intrinsic to evolution once you're past the minimum in complexity. McShay is arguing that no, there is not, and I agree with him.
So why are we thinking that? Or why are we teaching that?
We're not teaching that evolution has an ever-present trend towards complexity. But again, when you start at the minimum, you're going to trend up for a while, of necessity, since that's the only way to go.
This is not a creationist. This is an evolutionary biologist from the University of Michigan.
Whom Pete has quote-mined and who wouldn't agree with Mr. Greer on basically any of this talk so far.
So, evolution is all about illusion. You teach these things that you have absolutely no observational evidence to prove that one thing became another, and you teach it as a fact, and you call people, kind of not up with the times if they don't believe that.
No evidence of something evolving into other things, eh? I think it's time for the transitional species slideshow. Enjoy. After this, he preaches a bit about the Bible. This channel isn't for that, so we're skipping it. Basically, all he said was that the Mosaic Law helped with sanitation and prevented inbreeding. Maybe it did. If so, then good for the ancient Hebrews. If it didn't, then whatever.
Geologic features show evidence of a worldwide flood and rapid deposition of geologic layers.
Boy, do they ever not, but let's see what he has to say for himself. But before he really goes into this, he complains about people who think the flood was real but local. I don't care, he can have whatever catfight he wants with local flood believers. But I'll say this. We do know that there was no global flood, but we also do know that there were local floods, so maybe he should adopt the local flood idea so he can be only maybe wrong instead of definitely wrong.
We should find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth if there was a worldwide flood.
Specifically, we should find billions of dead things sorted hydrologically and not by taxonomy or ecology in global turbidite depositions. Instead, we find quadrillions of dead things, far more than could possibly have existed at once, in rock layers laid down in countless non-catastrophic ways. In the upper left, you'll see a link to an excellent video about just how many fossils you can find in just one part of the United States and why it precludes the flood model. It's by Joel Duff, who runs an excellent and criminally underviewed YouTube channel. Go check him out.
Do we? Yes, we do. We see huge geological layers laid down across most of our United States. This one, the Tapeats sandstone that you can see in the Grand Canyon.
But it's not global. You'd need a globally correlated turbidite deposition event to show a worldwide flood. Further, we have trace fossils in the Tapeats sandstone, such as burrows and trackways, but characteristically, flood deposits destroy trace fossils. So we know for a fact that Tapeats was not laid down by a flood. Instead, it was a marine transgression, meaning that the sea levels were high for a sustained period, and so what would be low elevation land at the current sea level were instead shallow oceans. But this is not a high energy event like a flood.
That didn't get laid down by a local flood. So I observed these things on some of my travels. I took a picture of the Badlands in South Dakota. Notice, the smooth transition between one layer and another.
Excuse me, the did you just say?
What are you talking about? Those pictures showed sharp boundaries between layers with virtually no transition in the first picture, and then sharp cliffs aligned with sediment layers in the next. That's not smooth transition. What is even happening right now? He's just lying to us with the evidence on screen.
This is the Grand Canyon. Once again, it's kind of smooth in between the layers.
Well, first it's not, but I also find it amusing that some creationists point out how abrupt the contact can be between strata as evidence of a flood. And here this guy is pretending the layers always have smooth transitions between them, as if that would help his case. I guess the layers are both too smooth and too abrupt. Only the magical flood that can deposit literally anything, regardless of physics or chemistry, can explain this.
And then this is from the Petrified National Forest. Once again, you see these smooth layers.
Is he maybe not talking about the transition between strata? Maybe he's just talking about how horizontal they are? I'm honestly just trying to figure out what Pete means in a way that isn't just nonsense.
Well, we didn't see those form, so they say it happened over millions of years, and they come up with their story, how it happened and everything. But then we had this flood in Washington that formed this canyon in 6 days.
Yeah, a canyon formed in a few hours through unconsolidated ash that had no switchbacks and basically no tributaries or other sharp turns like the Grand Canyon. In other words, it's only like the Grand Canyon in that they are both erosional features. Tell you what, Pete, get me a rapidly formed canyon that formed in less than a day and also has switchbacks that you didn't just set up yourself. I'll wait.
Notice the layers. It was formed rapidly by moving water and mud slurry.
Notice the layers! Yeah, everyone knows that laminae and tuff can be deposited rapidly in high volume. Because, volcanoes release a lot of material when they go boom. Cool, but is the Grand Canyon carved through tuff? Oh wait, it's not. Weird, it's almost like this whole thing is irrelevant.
Well, Mount St. Helens blew its top, and it left behind smooth layers. It left behind a canyon 1/40th the size of the Grand Canyon.
No.
The layers fell as ash, the muddy water carved the canyon. Does this guy need like baby's first geology book to help him figure out the most basic things about geology? The kind of stuff you normally cover when you're like 10 in school earth science class?
And the layers are there. just by rapidly moving mud and water. So I got to go there on that trip I took with Rick Oliver in 2010. That was kind of a bucket list thing that I wanted to see Spirit Lake especially. There's 400,000 logs still floating there in 2010.
Neat.
It started with 1 million. They came off that hillside right over my left shoulder there. The water went up there, washed 1 million logs down to that lake. Well, they've been sinking ever since. And they went down, and we have these things called Polystrate fossils. They're tree trunks that go up through many geological layers.
No, those will not form polystrate fossils, assuming they do fossilize. They will form fossils stretching across a few laminae, which are smaller layers within a stratum. They will not stretch to a new stratum, because Spirit Lake is a single depositional environment. So, when that eventually becomes lithified, it will all be the same stratum, and that stratum will contain many laminae, some of which will be tufaceous because of the eruption.
And we see this forming in the bottom of Spirit Lake, where every year, as the silt comes in and forms another layer, it's burying the logs that first sank. And the ones that sank later, they're being buried a little bit higher. So we're seeing these polystrate fossils actually form, and it's only been 41 years since Mount St. Helens, I think. And all this we see happening already, not over millions of years.
Except, again, you're not seeing it happen. And there are no polystrate fossils in the fossil record in the first place. So even if we were seeing it happen, there would be nothing to compare it to.
Bent sedimentary rock. So this was sedimentary rock, and in order for it to bend and not break, it had to be soft when that layer pushed down and folded it.
Incorrect. It needed to be under pressure and be hot, which fortunately for us is kind of what the interior of the Earth is like. Further, it is generally cracked, but creationists just like to lie about it. Further, if it were still unlithified when it bent, which does happen, the boundary between layers would be blurred and there would be a milky coloration there, as the cementing agents that are lithifying the rocks in question are squeezed into there. We don't see that. Even further, we have plastically deformed animal remains in some of these bent layers. If a dinosaur skull can bend with the sediment it's found in, then it sure wasn't in soft sediment, because that wouldn't have bent the skull. Instead, it bent as a hard fossil within the hard stone.
It didn't break, it didn't crumble, it just bent. There's a 90-degree turn right there, and you can see it's not bent, or, it's just it is bent, it's not fractured.
I actually can't see that because of low resolution.
Here's one that has the spiritual implication. That we know that God said in Genesis 3:18, "Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee." Okay, that was part of the curse, after sin. But we find this in the fossil record way, way, way before humans were allegedly on the earth, according to evolution.
Well, according to the fossil record, which doesn't contain a whiff of even primates, when we get our first thorns. I guess that sucks for a literal interpretation of Genesis, but that's not a reason to reject reality. It's a reason to reject either Genesis or that interpretation of it. Sorry, when anything and reality conflict, reality wins.
So, if thorns formed before humans, but God said that thorns weren't made until after Adam and Eve's sin, one of those two things is wrong.
Yeah, it's one that has no science backing it up, and science does back up ancient thorns before humans. Pointing out that your favorite interpretation of your favorite book contradicts that is not a point against science. It means literally nothing about what is true in reality.
It's in a flood layer. The flood came after Adam and Eve.
It might be in a flood layer. Lots of fossils are, but not all of them, or even most of them. But also, there has been no evidence provided that Adam and Eve were real people, and even if they were, they didn't predate thorns.
So if you believe the biblical view, you believe that that's not millions of years old, that it happened after Adam and Eve.
That's not the biblical view. It's a biblical view. And it's not even the majority view among people who have Genesis in their scriptures, that being Christians and Jews.
There's evidence from many cultures all over the world that dinosaurs and humans have coexisted in the not very distant past. Well, we have a problem. Some Christians say, I don't believe there's dinosaurs. It's not in the King James Bible. I don't see that word. So God put those bones there to test my faith.
That's dumb. The Bible also doesn't mention house cats. I feel like very few Christians would then deny the existence of house cats for that reason. In fact, some Christian groups have a long tradition of church cats, I've met a few church cats. To be fair, I don't think Pete thinks this is a good argument.
Well, there's a very simple solution to that. You don't find the word dinosaur in the Bible because it wasn't invented until 1841. King James Bible translated in 1611. You couldn't have had it in there. We have dragon, behemoth, leviathan, which I believe were all some form or another of dinosaur, but you don't have the actual word dinosaur. In the 1828 dictionary, you have computer, locomotive, and rocket, but you don't have the word dinosaur. It wasn't invented yet.
It's not that the word for rocket or dinosaur weren't invented. It's that those people had no word for those things because they didn't know what they were.
So we have dinosaur tracks.
We do, and that alone is enough to negate any possibility that all the strata with dinosaurs are flood layers.
We have mountains of dinosaur bones disarticulated like they were in this big flood and got washed up in a whirlpool that just pulled them apart.
Yeah, you see, the thing is, floods don't tend to dismember big animals. However, if the animals die, they start to rot, and then if a flood comes, you can get disarticulated fossil remains in a flood deposit, where the bones are graded by size. This actually does happen, but it can't have been the result of a single event. Sorry.
And then it dumped them all on these big mounds. This one's in China. We have another one like that in Dinosaur National Monument here in the United States.
Yep, floods happen and they can deposit bones. No one has ever argued against this to my knowledge. Oh, hello there. You must be lost. I am too, but I won't let that stop me from doing my job, talking about Pete Greer.
So we see this evidence that there were dinosaurs. So what says that they were really old? Well, radiometric dating. I'll get to that in a little while.
No, that's what tells us the degree to which they are old, with actual numerical precision. But that they are quite old, and many more than a few thousand years old, is confirmed by just stratigraphy. There is too much evident history in the rocks for all of them to have been formed in a recent flood. There are rock layers that cannot form quickly because it's physically impossible, and in many cases they can be hundreds of meters thick or more. There are ancient canyons inside the rock layers that show all the evidence of being slowly formed by erosion, such as Surprise Canyon. There are erosion surfaces, folded strata, etc., etc. This cannot be the result of a single flood a few thousand years ago. It's physically impossible.
But this is mummified dinosaur skin. It's not petrified, that's mummified dinosaur skin.
So-called mummified non-avian dinosaur skin is in fact petrified. Try again, Pete.
So we have found evidence of dinosaur skin, so that's how we can kind of make our models. We look at that. This is a Megalopteryx, and its skin is considered the best preserved dinosaur tissue to date.
Yeah, that is a really well-preserved dinosaur foot, because it's the foot of an upland moa, a bird from New Zealand that went extinct less than 1,000 years ago. I'm not sure what amazing evidence this is supposed to be. I've never heard of anyone saying that moas and humans didn't coexist.
That looks pretty fresh, doesn't it? I wouldn't want to be around that thing. It's got some sharp claws on it.
Yeah, it's pretty fresh, because again, that's a bird foot from a few centuries ago. He even correctly told us the genus. That's the foot of Megalopteryx didonus. It's kept in the Natural History Museum of London.
So we've also found, it's kind of a new thing in science, that we're finding dinosaur tissue that's not fossilized, or it's fresh tissue. And the one on the left, you can actually stretch that and it'll go back.
No, it's not fresh. It's not original tissue, and here's the discoverer Mary Schweitzer on it.
When we first found those little round red things in the bones of Tyrannosaurus rex, when I went to him and finally found enough courage to go up to my major advisor and say, we have these things, so they were the right size, they were the right shape, they contained iron, and they were localized to the blood vessels of this animal. Those are the only things I knew, and I went to him and I showed him. Plus, they seem to have nuclei of some sort, some kind of difference between the inside and the outside of these little red bodies, which, if they were dinosaurian red blood cells, they would have to have a nucleus. So this is what I showed him, and he said, so what do you think they are? And I said, well, they're in the right size, right shape, right whatever, but they can't be red blood cells. And he said, well, why not? And I said, well, because everyone knows they don't persist over this length of time. And he said, so prove to me they're not. And what that does is it takes my own personal bias out of, well, reduces my own personal bias because I'm trying to disprove my favorite idea. And so rather than trying to prove something in spite of the facts, you try to disprove using data and only data. And if you can't do it, it still stands. That's the thing I think a lot of people don't understand, is that it is the role of a scientist to disprove, not to prove. If you're doing science correctly, you are never going to prove anything. That's the job of mathematicians. We're not actually altered, some of them, to the degree that people were assuming. So when I came onto the scene, I was an older student of Jack's. I didn't start my PhD until I was 36. So when I started my research project, I was working to prepare a Tyrannosaurus Rex that Jack had just brought back from the field. And I noticed some things. I have a really, really sensitive nose, which can be the bane of my existence. But when I was preparing this dinosaur, it had an odor. And at the time I was teaching human cadaver labs. And it smelled like one particular cadaver we had in the lab that had died of cancer. And the cancer drugs he had been taking interacted with the embalming fluid to give it a very sweet odor. That's the first thing that came to my mind. So I noticed that, and then I noticed that this bone, the internal parts of the Tyrannosaurus Rex bone, looked just like modern horse. I mean, there was no extra mineralization. It looked like a horse that died about 10 years ago and sat out on the prairie. And so I started thinking, well, if it looks this way, maybe there's some tiny remnants of something original there that we can learn more about the animal. And so I was trying to figure out how to do this, and I made this this slide, I guess, and we saw these little round red things. And that's when Jack said, Mary, this is too big for a master's degree. I want you to switch to a PhD. And so that's what I did. And that's when he said, prove to me they're not. And it changed everything. It's like use data to disprove what you think they are. And in the process, I couldn't. I still can't. I don't know what those red things are because I don't have the data to say. But we've moved on since then, and we've looked at other bone. We've used more and more increasingly complex methods to study this bone. And what we found is that there seems to be pieces of protein that can only come from vertebrates, and it can only come from something that is not a mammal. And we've been able to show this using antibodies, which are complexes that you produce. When you get a cold, you have an antibody against the cold virus so you can get better. We capitalize on the immune system of animals to make antibodies against these proteins, and we use them on our dinosaur tissue. If they bind and you do all your controls correctly, which is key, you can say with pretty strong confidence that these 3 and 4 amino acid epitopes of the original protein are there. And so we've used paleoimmunology for a long time now with a lot of different specimens. And most recently, one of my former graduate students and my current postdoc have been building upon the idea that you can actually sequence these proteins.
Notably, she was a creationist until she became a paleontologist.
The second one is so fresh it looks like he got it from the meat market.
I don't know where Pete gets his meat, but where I get mine, that meat doesn't need a 2-week soak in acid in order to become pliable. If you're getting meat that needs a 2-week acid bath, I'd say change grocers.
The third one has markings on it that can't possibly last for 65 million years.
What markings? Why can't they last 65 or, more accurately, 66 million years?
It was a T-Rex bone that this was found in. They supposedly ended 65 million years ago.
66, not 65, but yes, it was Tyrannosaurus rex femur. And no, I'm not going to say it was a T. regina or a T. imperosus. That hypothesis at the time of this writing is still not well supported enough to overturn the single species referral of Tyrannosaurus specimens.
We've also found red blood cells.
Nope, we found structures that are morphologically consistent with red blood cells, like Dr. Schweitzer said. But also, like she said, we can't say that they're blood cells because we don't have that data to support that.
And so 65 million years old red blood cells, I don't think so. You got to have a lot of faith to believe that.
There is no guaranteed shelf life for red blood cells, which again, isn't what we have, or at least we can't be sure. especially since we know that high amounts of iron makes preservation of various proteins as molecular fossils easier. And hey, you know what red blood cells have a lot of? Oh, it's iron.
Evolutionists have a lot of faith in some of their stuff that they say. They don't have direct observational evidence, so they have to have faith.
Except we have experimental evidence backing all of this up, including the stratigraphy, the taphonomy, and the radiometric data. Sorry, Petey. But this isn't faith, it's evidence.
Well, we also have historical accounts that say that what we used to call dragons, what was called dragons in the past, were really real. This is in the history of Europe, is Sir George killing the last dragon so that the king's daughter, who got drawn by lot to be sacrificed that month or whatever it was.
My goodness, this story isn't associated with St. George until the 1200s. He died in AD 303. The story was originally associated with another saint, and it didn't happen in Europe. The location of the story bounces between Asia Minor and North Africa, depending on the telling. There's no reason to take this story seriously, and even if we did, Pete here isn't even telling it correctly.
And so he said, "No, king, I will save your daughter," and he went and killed the dragon.
And then everyone clapped. Might as well put that in r/that happened.
And that's in the history books.
Weird how when I was getting my history degree, we never looked at medieval hagiographies for our history about the 4th century. Not even in my Christian history class. Almost like looking at hagiography from 1,000 years after the events in question isn't a good way to do history.
And the brass carvings of dinosaurs on the tomb of Bishop Bell, who was buried in the 15th century.
These carvings have heads on their tails. Are we going to say this is evidence for dinosaurs with heads on their necks and tails? If not, then this is just a fanciful creature.
They knew what those dinosaurs looked like then. They hadn't put them together yet. And then, have you ever thought about the Chinese zodiac? Now,
Not much, and given the general Christian take on astrology, I'm not sure why he is either.
just to clarification for the kids, we do not believe in zodiacs, okay? I'm just showing you that they had 12 animals.
The zodiac is just the constellations on the ecliptic. The ecliptic exists, the constellations are arbitrary, but if you're going to divide the sky up into constellations, you can't not have a zodiac.
And dragon was one of them. All the rest of them are real animals. I believe when they came up with this that the dragon was too.
Cool hypothesis. Time to go test it by finding verifiably recent dragon remains. But do note that Chinese dragons have beards, deer antlers, snake skin, and bird claws. So they're not dinosaurs, they're chimeras. The good news is that while finding a modern non-avian dinosaur wouldn't do anything to disprove evolution, or even hint that it might not be correct, finding a chimera like a Chinese dragon sure would.
This is South America, another culture that existed about that same time.
The ichthyostones depicting dinosaurs all lack provenance. Many of them are confirmed frauds. They all depict dinosaurs in wildly inaccurate ways. I'm not letting him go on about it. I refuse to keep talking about the goddamn ichthyostones. They're stupid, and until someone manages to get one with dinosaurs and proper provenance, no one should care.
They put it on their pottery.
It's a lizard, and it doesn't look like a dinosaur, even if it's not.
And this is back in China again. They have a big influence of the dragon.
Which dinosaur had 3 toes with one inverted and a curly dragging tail with back spikes? Oh, was it no dinosaur? Yeah, to be evidence, it would actually have to look like an actual dinosaur, not like what you might have seen one constructed as if you were in the 1880s and had never actually seen a dinosaur fossil but only heard them described to you.
In their culture, but this particular one looks remarkably like a theropod dinosaur.
No, it doesn't. It looks like a weird bird-lizard chimera made by someone who never really bothered to look closely at the feet, legs, or head of either.
Made way before we had models or books showing what we think dinosaurs look like.
Hey, he finally got something right. The figurine was made before anyone knew what a dinosaur looks like. That's probably why it looks so little like a dinosaur.
So I think we have some pretty good models because they look a lot like this.
1, that's not how sauropods actually looked. 2, that's not a single figure. It's several humans standing under a snake. And 3, it's been doctored by creationists to make it look like one figure. The original does not look this clear, and analysis has recovered the separate human figures as just that, separate human figures, not the legs of a sauropod.
This is in a cave in Utah, cave drawing.
It's on a rock, but not in a cave, but who cares? That's not terribly important.
And I believe when Noah got off the ark, God said, you can eat meat now, right? He let them eat meat. So we see some evidence that humans hunted dinosaurs, which would help explain why some of them became extinct.
Again, that's a cool hypothesis, but now we need actual physical evidence of dinosaurs, or at least some historical evidence that is, actually real.
And so these guys, this is in Egypt, it's a mural, and it shows some guys hunting a dinosaur.
This mosaic is not from Egypt. It's from Palestrina, Italy, and there's a good chance the artist who made it had never been to Egypt. The creature shown on screen by Pete is labeled crocodile leopard and has a leopard's fangs, something no dinosaur had. This animal is not identifiable as belonging to any known group of dinosaurs and is labeled as a mix between a leopard and a crocodile. So why are we thinking it's anything other than that, a chimera? Interestingly enough, above this animal in the section Pete isn't showing you, there is a land crocodile that is clearly part dog, part crocodile. Interesting how we're not shown that. It's almost like in context this isn't very good evidence that there were dinosaurs in the Nile. We could have at least had a Spinosaurus aegypticus, an actual river-dwelling dinosaur from Egypt. Instead, we get something that looks like an exaggerated river otter. Although, since there are no otters in Egypt, I don't know if that's a reasonable option either. I will say that I can't find any references to Crocodile pardalis anywhere but this one mosaic. So no matter what it is, it probably isn't something that was actually reported from Egypt, as anything, let alone as an actual animal. The same is true for the land crocodile, listed as Crocodilus scarsios.
And this is a cave drawing, and once again in Utah. It shows what looks like dinosaurs there, that was part of their hunting.
So I can only find this on one creationist website. The website says it's Havasupai, which would make it Arizona, not Utah. But it is more consistent with Utah rock art, which tends to use ochre rather than Arizona desert rock art, which tends to be made by scraping off the desert varnish on the rocks. I will note that the supposed dinosaur isn't integrated well with the other figures and seems to be in a different style. Look at the bison below it. It's made of strong, confident lines, and the torso lines don't cover up the closer legs. Look at the supposed dinosaur. Each stroke was done several times as if by a hesitant artist, and the line defining the torso of the animal covers the shoulder area of the front left leg. I can't say for certain that this is a late addition, vandalizing this rock art to lie for Jesus and convince people that prehistoric but human-inhabited Utah had dinosaurs, but it's suspicious enough that until that possibility is precluded, it seems the more likely one. I would love if anyone recognizes this art if they could let me know where to learn more about it.
And I don't blame them at all, because man, have you ever had one of those dinosaur legs?
Yes, if you've ever had a drumstick or thigh meat from a bird, you've had a dinosaur leg. Also, before anyone goes there, I do not think that he is taking this picture seriously as an actual dinosaur part in a grocery store. Although I should note that it's actually the hand, not the foot of a dinosaur, that has been modeled. And it is in the wrong position, but whatever, it's just a joke.
They are delicious. They taste just like frog's legs. And so, Photoshop again, just so everybody knows, okay?
I think it's more likely a physical sculpture, but I don't really care how it was made, and Pete isn't taking it seriously, so I won't either.
But, everybody's fascinated with dinosaurs. That's why we need to know the truth about them. Well, if you go to Kentucky, the ark that they built, a lot of people say you couldn't get the dinosaurs on the ark. Well, why not? Look how huge it was. This was built using a royal cubit of the dimensions listed in the Bible.
I don't think the problem people have with dinosaurs on the ark is that you couldn't get them through the door. It's more like, why is it that the actual ark encounter has a zookeeping staff of dozens to care for their hundreds of times smaller collection of animals, when Noah apparently managed to make it work with 8 people and some animals that need far more care than a lemur colony?
And when you go inside, they show you, first of all, you don't have to take the great big giant adult dinosaurs on the ark. God would have probably sent juveniles. They would have reproduced longer afterwards.
Juveniles would reduce the food and space problems a bit, although less than you think, since juveniles have to eat more pound for pound than adults, since they're still growing. But it has its own problems with the fact that juveniles often have a higher mortality rate, and often need to be shown how to be adults by adult conspecifics. You can't just take, say, a baby elephant, raise it without contact with adult elephants, and expect it to not be an antisocial dick rather than a functional elephant. Why should we expect dinosaurs were so different? We know many of them showed high degrees of parental care. This would almost certainly have involved socialization. Plus, you still end up with large numbers of gigantic creatures, since dinosaurs tend to grow fairly fast, and over the course of more than a year, on the ark's trip, many of them would have become subadults nearly as big as an adult of the same species. One last thing, I know the audio sync is going in Pete's video. That's a problem with the original, and I'm trying to fix it as we go. Sorry about that.
I have many more pictures of this ark. I just had to cut it way down for this, but just to show you that it was no problem to get all the two of every kind of animal on the ark and 7 of the clean.
Showing that Ken Ham managed to put some model sauropods in his theme park isn't evidence of anything.
So in the Bible, we see references to dragons as real animals.
Fire-breathing kaiju snakes aren't dinosaurs.
probably dinosaurs. If you look at the Jeremiah, that he swallowed me up like a dragon, sounds like they were pretty big and fearsome, huh?
Hey look, it's old friend of the channel, Tannin, a Hebrew word which can refer to a giant mythical chaos snake, but also crocodiles. So sure, if a dinosaur existed when this was written, it may well have been called that. But there are also other animals that were called that, so this isn't evidence of anything. But even if the Bible never talked about such creatures, it also wouldn't be evidence against them. I'll remind you that the Bible doesn't mention house cats, but I'm pretty confident they existed back in Bible times.
All right, let's move on to radiometric dating.
Let's radiometric get to know each other first. See how that goes.
Radiometric dating techniques have been shown to be highly inaccurate.
Highly inaccurate, huh? Weird how dates are almost always concordant, in order, and when we actually use the techniques properly, we get correct known ages for historically formed rocks within the calendar year reported from history.
And they rely on several unprovable assumptions. I don't have the unprovable assumptions in here, but you got to, before you even start, you gotta say how much parent material's there, how much daughter material's there.
Depends. In the case of isochron dating, the initial amounts of daughter and parent isotopes cancels out, so they don't matter. In some other cases, like potassium-argon, we know that argon cannot be primordial because the argon comes out of solution in molten rock and can't be incorporated in the crystals that form as it cools, because argon is a noble gas. So no, we don't always need to know the starting conditions, and in many cases where we do, we actually can know such things.
What the rate of decay is?
Well, the rate of spontaneous decay is constant and determined by fundamental constants of physics, like the fine structure constant. To change such things would require the laws of physics to change fundamentally. But in cases where there is a way to cause decay rates to change, such as induced fission, beta capture, or the photonuclear effect, the products are not the same as the spontaneous decay, so we can tell if there is a history of such activity. In fact, that is how we know that Oklo is a natural nuclear reactor in which induced fission has been happening for longer than young Earthers think the universe has been around.
You got to presume how much leaching contaminated it, how much stuff.
For chemicals to leach out of a rock, it usually has to be heated, and so it'll be metamorphosed, and such rocks are not used for dating. As for contamination, yes, it's a problem, but that's what lab controls and multiple samples are for. And this isn't just a problem for radiometric dating, it's a problem for all lab work. Somehow I don't think Pete would invalidate, say, bacterial culturing for medical diagnoses because contamination can occur.
You got to assume all these things because you didn't see it happen. It happened millions of years ago, so you got to assume it.
The only untested assumption here is that physics didn't just break for some reason in the past. That's one of the basic assumptions of science. If we toss that out, then all of science goes with it.
So it's already got a bunch of problems, but let's see some more.
I'd like to see just one first, but oh well.
Actually using it, okay? How do we know that it's inaccurate? Because dates that don't agree, discordant dates for the same sample, using various methods or the same method on various parts of the same sample. One example out of many that I have on my talk on this. One part of the mammoth carbon dated 29,500 years, and the same mammoth, another part of it, dated 44,000 years.
This is an old, long debunked Hoven talking point. It was two different mammoths, both reported on in the same place. It's not surprising that two different mammoths would give different radiocarbon dates.
Then we have a rock that was actually taken out of, in 1986, 6 years after the explosion, another dome started building up in there. They took this dacite rock out of there. It dated, the whole rock was 350,000 years. A crystal of feldspar, 340,000 years. A crystal of amphiboly, 900,000 years. A crystal of pyroxene, 2,800,000 years. They saw it form in 1986. Should raise a little doubt in your mind here.
Ah, Steve Austin. I've already covered this, so here's Dapper from the past. So let's talk about the guy who did this study, Steve Austin, the $6 million man.
Steve Austin, astronaut, a man barely alive. Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man.
Wait, no, wrong Steve Austin. Let's talk about Stone Cold Steve Austin. Darn, still not the right one. Okay, I got it. Let's talk about creationist Dr. Steve Austin, a confirmed hack fraud. Now, you might think it's a bit of a stretch to call the good doctor a hack fraud, but in fact, this study that Dan Biddle is talking about is why I'm calling him a hack fraud. So Austin took 5 samples to be potassium-argon dated from the Mount St. Helens deposit. He took them to a lab that only had basic equipment for such dating, namely the Geochron laboratories in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They no longer do potassium-argon dating there, But at the time they did, they warned that they could not reliably date anything much younger than 2 million years. This means that essentially any date they gave that was 2 million years or under was essentially the same date and couldn't be distinguished from a date of 0 years. Interestingly enough, that's 4 out of the 5 dates. Let's go into why the dates are incorrect. With the relatively inexpensive machines that Cambridge was using, small amounts of argon remain in the test chambers because being a heavy inert gas, it's not easy to get all of it out of the place it has settled into. Higher end machines can, but these could only partially evacuate the argon from the test chambers. Now, for rocks of over 2 million years old, this small argon signal from residual argon of other tests isn't a big deal, and will tend to get lost in the instrument error. However, for very young samples, this residual signal is essentially the only argon signal the machine is likely to pick up. As a result, the machine will always give results with significant age from a few 100,000 years to about 2 million years old, because it is physically incapable of doing otherwise. So Dr. Austin either knowingly submitted samples to a test he knows can't be run on them reliably, or he's so incompetent that he can't even figure out the problem. So yeah, like I said, he's a hack fraud. But then what about the 2.8 million year test date? Which, by the way, had an error margin of 600,000 years. That was a sample of pyroxenes, and in the original write-up about this little experiment, Austin et al. Have pictures of the pyroxenes under the microscope. And it has little granules that Austin says were not older material, but were simply materials of the same age. However, he does not really justify that statement, and other geologists note that they are consistent with what are called xenocrysts, which are small inclusions of significantly older crystal. Such contamination would give anomalously old readings. While Austin simply dismisses this possibility, real scientists have no such luxury. So essentially, in the one date that even could be valid, we have good reason to think that there is contamination from much older rock. Overall then, this study says more about Austin's honesty and ability to do science than it does about radiometric dating.
Radiocarbons found in many things and many layers presumed to be millions of years old.
Most such measurements are indistinguishable from background, and there are sources of radiogenic carbon-14 underground, such as neutron captured by nitrogen-14 impurities, which we know occur. Next.
So fossils, coal, oil, natural gas, limestone, marble, and graphite, all supposed to be millions of years old, from every flood-related geological layer, and even some pre-flood deposits have all contained measurable amounts.
Amusingly, while I didn't include it as it added nothing new, Pete before this included a bit from the RATE project done by Answers in Genesis that hilariously concluded that radiometric dating seemed consistent with physics and that they need a miracle to make it not work. It was a complete and utter failure, and it admitted as such, despite the fact that now its proponents rely on people not bothering to read its results and then tout it as a great triumph of creation science. You know, because you can only be two of these three: honest, well-informed creationist.
Pieces of fossilized wood in all of these different layers, supposedly 32 to 250 million years ago, all have carbon-14 in them.
Yep, they do, as expected, but not in concordant amounts that give reliable dates, like we get with biological material from within the useful date range of carbon-14 dating. Those are amazingly concordant when proper controls are taken.
Radiometric dating techniques do not give accurate dates for rocks of known age and give dates in thousands for living organisms. So,
oh hey, it's from Andrew Snelling. Well, since I already pointed out that putting such a sample in a test chamber, or putting no sample in, will get you a readout on any carbon dating equipment, this isn't significant, so I won't go on about that. But I will point out that Andrew Snelling is one of the most blatant liars I know of. Here's a link to my coverage of just one of his talks in which he knowingly lies to his audience over, and I call him out on it.
Here's some more rocks. You can see less than 200 years dated at 22.8 million.
Weird how when proper controls are taken by real scientists, we can date the eruption of Vesuvius to the exact calendar date of the year of our Lord 79. I have 2 different papers to that effect linked in the sources.
Less than 800 years old dated at 13 million, and less than 500 years old dated at 12.6 million years. So these were all things that we've seen happen in recorded history. And then we dated it and got these horrendous results.
It would have been nice to get things like citations, error bars, techniques used, something. As is, I can only speculate, and so let's assume that all of these dates are actually dates that someone got after running the sample through some kind of radiometric testing. As is, I can only speculate, and so let's assume that all of these dates are actually dates that someone got after running the samples through some kind of radiometric testing. Well, all of these dates are under 1,000 years old, which is well under the defined minimum for most radiometric techniques, so you tend to get nonsense when you test them. But also, what's the error? 22.8 million as a result might be correct on a 200-year-old sample if the margin of error is higher than 22.8 million years. Now that might sound like a high margin of error, but if you're testing, say, a 3 billion-year-old rock, that margin of error is only 0.76%. On the other hand, if you're measuring a rock from a geological standpoint that is fresh out of the oven, you're not going to get a date that is meaningful on a human timescale.
Shells from living snails, carbon dated at 27,000 years old. Shells of living mollusks from 23,000 years old. That's from Science magazine.
Yep, marine organisms are unsuitable for carbon dating because of the well-known reservoir effect, where old carbon ends up in marine environments, and new carbon is only slow to enter it since marine organisms aren't getting their carbon from the air, where fresh carbon-14 is present, but from the ocean. That's why, as a rule, no one dates such remains with carbon-14, and the few studies that did were done to validate the idea that there was a reservoir effect. Also, why is he separating out snails and from mollusks? Snails are mollusks. It's like distinguishing horses and mammals, or iguanas and lizards.
So, here's the logic. With rocks of known age, and we can clearly see it doesn't work, why should we believe it with the rocks of unknown age that the scientists pull up and they say, okay, we dated this and it's this old, give or take a few, 1,000 years.
Because they have, in fact, successfully dated rocks of known historical ages, and the dates are broadly concordant, and also line up with other things like sedimentology. And for carbon-14, it can also be checked with other dating techniques like dendrochronology, ice core dating, and thermoluminescence.
Why should we believe that? Well, let me tell you, we shouldn't. As Bible-believing Christians, it's telling us a lie that the earth is millions of years old when it isn't.
See, there's the real reason. It's not the evidence. It's that a particular interpretation of a particular book indicates otherwise. Well, guess what? Science doesn't care. That book isn't evidenced in science.
So what they do is they give you part of the picture. So here you have part of 4 different things, and a little quarter's cut out of there, and how many of you can kind of see where your mind fills in a rectangle there? Can you kind of see a rectangle when you look at that? But it's not really there. Your mind fills it in. That's the evolutionary game. They give you facts here, facts there, and they expect your mind to fill in the gaps and believe what they're saying.
Nope. All the evidence is right there in the literature. The fact that most people don't bother to read it doesn't mean it's being hidden. Science is one of the most transparent things humans have ever done, because that transparency is what allows others to repeat experiments to see if they get the same results, or check the math of other researchers. Without this openness, science would collapse. The fact that the full data doesn't trickle down to Fox News articles doesn't mean that anyone is hiding anything.
There are many actual observations in the present that shows and verifies that the Earth is young, such as 90% of the processes that we use for dating don't give billions of years. And you got to have billions of years for evolution.
Let's just quickly go over the ones he listed on the slide. Helium in the atmosphere. Well, helium is added by nuclear decay all the time. Helium in the ground. Same thing. Meteor dust. What about it? Buildup of carbon-14. Again, what about it? Human population. Nothing about this can be used to argue about the age of the Earth, or even humanity. Populations don't just grow at some steady rate through time. Natural plutonium. Again, what about it? Sediment on the sea. Sediment is removed from the sea by subduction. It doesn't just build up indefinitely. Oil leaks in Earth. What about them? Natural gas in Earth. What about it? Coral reef growth. Coral reefs didn't start growing at the dawn of Earth, so you can't use them to date the age of the whole planet. Oldest living plants. There's no reason to think a plant can live as long as the Earth has been around, so this is useless. Human civilizations. There is no reason to think that human civilizations started with the Earth. This is also useless. River delta growth. Rivers come and go and change course and flow type. This is useless. Undersea oil seepage. This sounds the same as oil leaks in Earth. Same thing. What about it? Uranium in sea. What about it? Neutrons and lead. What about them? Rotation of spiral galaxies. This has nothing to do with Earth and also displays ignorance of what spiral arms are. They're not a collection of particular objects, but a pressure wave that does not move in the same way as the bodies that orbit around the galaxy. Interstellar gas expansion. What about it? Carbon-14 and meteorites. What about it? Also, this couldn't be a problem for the age of the Earth, even if it were a problem for carbon-14 dating. Decay of comets. There are sources for new comets. Interplanetary dust removal. What about it? Lifetime of meteor showers. What about them? Peat bog growth. Peat bogs come and go throughout time as climate shifts. This is useless. Multi-layer fossils. There are no such fossils if by layers we mean strata. Hardening of rock. What about it? Potassium in the sea. Same thing with sedimentation in the sea. Minerals are both added to and subtracted from the sea. This is useless. Titan's methane loss. Yeah, no one really knows where the new methane is coming from, but we don't exactly have lots of information on Titan. But even if this were a problem for the age of Titan, Titan is neither the universe nor Earth. Internal heat of Io. It's tidal. Leaching of chlorine. From what? What about it? Radiogenic lead. What about it? Niagara Falls. Waterfalls come and go as rivers change course through time. There is no reason to think that Niagara Falls is as old as the Earth. This is useless. Stone Age burials. What about them? Okay, so as we can see, most of these are just words, and the few that are obvious enough that one can even make out what the argument is, they're worthless.
So you can't have it. 90% of the processes don't give you billions. The ones that do, the radiometric dating techniques, right?
You can't just shotgun 50 different things, none of which, as far as I can tell, are ways you could even in principle date the age of the Earth, and then just declare that this means the Earth is young. I mean, obviously you can, but it's stupid.
So here's a ship that sank in 1852. The bell's encased in solid rock.
So these are the servants' bells, which were concreted together. Concretions can happen quickly. That doesn't mean that chalk or non-flocculated fine-grained shale can form quickly. Different kinds of rocks are different. I know that's baby level, but apparently Pete here needs baby level geology instruction.
Here's a flour that was left at a flour mill, and it was flooded, and 3 weeks later they had a rock for a bag of flour.
Calcite concretions form quickly in hard water. This isn't news.
To their credit, they changed their sign. We used to think it took millions of years, but now we know it can happen as fast as 3 weeks.
Who changed what sign?
Rick Oliver says he can do it in his lab in 1 day. Just got to have the right conditions.
Lots of things can be done more quickly in a lab with controlled ideal conditions than they can happen out in the wild where conditions are not controlled and ideal. This includes much of geology, like crystal formation, oil formation, etc.
Diamonds, once again, the rate team said, okay, diamonds should have carbon-14 in them.
Pete, you already did carbon-14. We're not doing it again. It was stupid before. It's still stupid.
The most important reason to doubt radiometric dating, it does not agree with what the plain reading of God's word to man, the Holy Bible, tells us.
Completely meaningless to science. Science goes with the evidence, not some pre-concluded idea that cannot be changed. That's how you end up being wrong. But hey, at least Pete is being open about his intellectual dishonesty being the foundation for why he rejects science. That's nice of him.
I'm a simple guy. I like to just read it and believe it. I think God is responsible for bringing me accurate, scripture.
Neat, but again, that means nothing for science.
And if he doesn't, then it's not my fault if I miss the mark, it's his. But he's a perfect God. He's not going to do that. He's an all-powerful God. He's going to maintain his word through the ages so that I can believe it.
Way to throw God under the bus, since if taken the way Pete takes it, the Bible is absolutely not right about the history of the Earth. And that has been demonstrated tens of thousands of times. But Pete could just decide to not take the Bible the way a baby with brain damage might, and instead could grow out of the childish things and take into account things like the polemic nature of Genesis and its cultural context. But nah, that's less fun than pretending that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and that great-great-great-granddaddy might have fought a baryonyx and called it a dragon. At this point, he just tries to justify his interpretation of Genesis. Since his interpretation is at odds with reality, I don't care about his theology. I'm skipping that.
The micro-demand theory of evolution violates several laws and well-established theories of science, plus it's often illogical.
Ooh, I wonder which laws.
So let's consider this house. This is a very unusual house. It was in an empty field. This tornado came through Oklahoma. It tore up all these old houses and all these trees and everything, and it boom, right in the middle of that empty field, that appeared.
Are we really doing Fred Hoyle's tornado in a junkyard? That was dumb in 1983 when Hoyle said it, and it's been refuted 1,000 times. Let's go back a few decades to talk origins and give you their response. 1. This claim is irrelevant to the theory of evolution itself, since evolution does not occur via assembly from individual parts, but rather via selective gradual modifications to existing structures. Order can and does result from such evolutionary processes. Hoyle applied his analogy to abiogenesis, where it is more applicable. However, the general principle behind it is wrong. Order arises spontaneously from disorder all the time. The tornado itself is an example of order arising spontaneously. Something as complicated as people would not arise spontaneously from raw chemicals, but there is no reason to believe that something as simple as a self-replicating molecule could not form thus. From there, evolution can produce more and more complexity.
Bang, it was there. Tornado house, right there. Everybody believe me? Well, oh, okay. Well, yeah, we know that somebody had to go in there and do the electricity, the plumbing, the concrete work, the drywall, the roof. Everything that's there was a result of intelligence putting it together to make a grand product.
Yep, and the way we know that this is how houses work is that we watch them get built, and that's how they're built. But when organisms come about, we don't see some intelligent agent doing it. They do it all on their own without help from any apparent outside intelligent agent. So we have no reason to introduce one in Abiogenesis or the theory of evolution.
Okay? And nobody would deny that, would they? If they were in their right mind, anyway.
No, because again, we watch houses get built, and they're built by people, unlike living things.
So then we need to look at this apple tree. Which one's actually more complex and well designed?
It doesn't matter, because no one has ever seen a construction crew or an analog thereof build an apple tree from the ground up according to blueprints. Apple trees grow themselves from stored patterns that themselves can be seen to vary naturally without any intentionality.
Well, I didn't see the house build itself. I said it did, but we knew it didn't. But that came from a seed. And inside that seed was a code. How'd that code get there? Did it just happen by chance and random processes?
We know how genes come about. This isn't a mystery. Mutations, drift, selection, and recombination. That's what we can see, and it is more than sufficient to explain apple trees. What we don't see is anyone creating apple trees from the ground up like we do with houses.
I don't think so. That tree, first of all, grew roots, because if it grew the leaves first, it would have died because it wouldn't have any way to get nutrients up there to feed it.
So there's a strong selection pressure for roots to grow down. Cool.
And it has a chlorophyll. It makes its own food.
Hey look, endosymbiosis, another mechanism of evolution. Isn't Pete supposed to be proposing problems for evolution?
And it has apples, which we eat.
Hey, a seed dispersal mechanism that allows animals to symbiotically spread the offspring of the tree. Not sure why that's a problem.
All those things are there, and they benefit us, and they're put there by God.
Well, the wild apple tree with tiny sour apples doesn't benefit people all that much. He's talking about domesticated trees, and the benefits to humans from them are largely the result of evolution directed by humans, not God, during historical times. The wild apple tree primarily benefits wildlife who spread its seeds and eat its nectar while pollinating. But since we have a naturalistic and non-miraculous explanation for the evolution of plants, the fact that they exist isn't really a problem for evolution. Pete is going to have to say why these things couldn't evolve, not simply state that they can't. Basically, this same argument could be made, and then the statement, so God can't be real, could be tagged onto it, and it would be just as effective.
And we see his design as manifest in that in a miraculous way.
I'm not aware of any part of the process of apple reproduction that requires a miracle.
And to believe that happened by chance and random processes would take a tremendous amount of faith.
Maybe, but evolution isn't just a chance process. So I'm not aware of anyone who thinks that apple trees came about because of random atoms flying around randomly, smashing together randomly. You think maybe he'll stop strawmanning evolution? I'm not going to hold my breath for it.
In Hebrews, it says every house is built by someone, but he who built all things is God. Yep.
Look, if you want to say God is the ultimate necessary metaphysical being who grounds and creates reality or something like that, then fine, have fun. But there is no reason to think that just because apples exist, he had to directly make them via a miracle.
You're just going to be so much more amazed of God. I invite you to look at animals, look at the human body, take each system apart and see all the parts that make the system. Take each organ apart and see all the tissues that make the organs. Take all the tissues apart and see all the cells that make the tissues. And then they all put together and they work by themselves and with the other systems in our body. It's miraculous.
This argument basically comes down to cool things exist, therefore God. But the problem is that no one is disputing that cool things exist. If you want to conclude from them God, you have to actually make a logical bridge as to why they necessitate God. Otherwise, you're just pointing to things and saying, look, like a 1-year-old who just learned that they can make adults notice things by pointing and saying, look.
When I taught biology, I called it the miraculous human body, because you can't deny it's a miracle.
The human body is not a miracle. Oh, hey. Yes, I can. Pete, why would you lie to me like that?
Bet they do. We came from a bacteria, if that's the belief.
No, it's not. The common ancestor of humans and bacteria wasn't a bacterium, although it was a prokaryote since that's a grade, not a clade. Sure, you might think that this looks like a bacterium, but it probably lacked many of the things that today we associate with bacteria, like operons. No modern species is the ancestor of humans.
So in the biology books, they have a whole bunch of horrible stuff that we know is not true. Like this one says that we used to have a tail.
That is true enough. Every human used to have a tail. They all grow them in embryo.
You never had a tail. You had a backbone that extended past your body when you were first formed.
That is what a tail is, you goddamn moron. Don't worry, you also don't have a brain. You just have a big mass of neurons in your cranium. You don't have any teeth. You just have enamel-covered dentin set into your jaws. You think you're a vertebrate? You just have jointed, segmented bones protecting your spinal cord.
But then your body caught up with it and surpassed it, and it ended up being where it is today. It was never a tail.
So yeah, you did have a tail. No, it was just a post-anal extension of the spine. You know, the exact thing a tail is. But if I just say that humans are special boys and that it's not a tail, it's a dangle-glorbin, for reasons, then yay, evolution is fake now.
And they say, of course, because we all had tails, that we came from a common ancestor. Nope.
Who, all humans? Because as far as I know, common ancestry for humans isn't disputed. If he means all tetrapods, well, their common embryological development is indeed evidence of common ancestry, because all tetrapods are built up as successive changes to the details of more and more fundamentally anatomy as you go back both in geological and ontological time. If they did not share common ancestry, there's no reason why they should all have such similar embryological development.
It says we had gill slits.
It doesn't say that, not even on the on-screen slide. It says gill pouches. And while I prefer pharyngeal arches, yes, humans and chicken and fish and frog embryos all have pharyngeal arches. But no, they are not gill slits.
Those gill slits, they don't have anything to do with respiration. It said it became our lungs.
Amazing. Every word of what you just said was wrong.
They don't become lungs. And if they did, they would have something to do with respiration. I now want to know what Pete is smoking and whether I can get some and turn it into an edible form since my lungs are bad as it is, and I don't need lots of extra smoke.
We know that's a false. We've known it for years, and it's in the biology book.
I don't even know what it is that he thinks is false that's still in the biology books. Does he think that biology books say that pharyngeal arches do have to do with respiration in humans? Because I doubt that they do say that.
It says, on this one, it says that each succeeding thing as we evolved added new information to the old information to become the new thing.
Does it? I doubt it, because there is no objective way to quantify information in organisms that we could say with certainty whether a turtle, a duck, a pig, or a human has more or less information than the others.
There's no known way to do that. Science has never observed useful information being added to the genome, and yet it's right there in the biology book, the one I was teaching back in the 90s.
Back in the 90s, I was in a very famous TV show.
Let me introduce you to the icefish, which, because of a gene duplication followed by subsequent mutations, managed to evolve a brand new antifreeze protein that allows it to exist in frigid environments. Seems to me like a brand new protein that didn't involve the loss of anything at all, and is brand new information, no matter how we might define it. Neat, that.
It's horrible. It's misleading. It's a lie. And yet it's still there.
So far, nothing has been a lie from any of these textbooks. I'm less confident about that for things that Pete has said, but I'm not quite to the point where I think he couldn't possibly be colossally ignorant, as opposed to just being dishonest.
If I think about that too long, I never taught evolution in my classroom. I would talk about it and I would compare it with the other view. And I never got in trouble, thank goodness, but My principal was a Christian who helped me get creation materials.
So he was objectively bad at his job. I feel sorry for his students. He should have gotten in trouble for teaching anti-science nonsense in a science classroom.
And that's the special place that we live in here. So Werner Gett, who is a creationist, said there is no known law of nature, no known process known to man, sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. He put $25,000 up and says, if you can disprove this statement, I'll give you $25,000. He's dead now, but he never had to pay anybody.
As a rule, such monetary challenges are publicity scams, with rules designed so that it would be impossible for anyone to win no matter how right they were or how much they actually demonstrated the thing that is said can't be demonstrated. Basically, this is done by having biased people judge if the challenge has been met and shifting the goalposts in the actual rules of the challenge, which most people won't bother to read. Anyway, I don't really care what gets said. Anything which can be encoded in a binary sequence, whether natural or not, whether created by intelligence or not, has information. So the spectrum of a star creates information. A mudslide creates information. The spin of a pulsar creates information. Information is created all the time by natural forces. If Pete wants to define information in some other way than Shannon information, he's welcome to. But until he does and then shows how his new definition is relevant to biology, and also precludes information from coming from natural, non-intelligent sources, this argument means as much as if he'd farted into a balloon and popped it in our faces. It's meaningless and odious.
We think that apes separated from humans about 5 million years ago.
No, humans never separated from apes. That's impossible. But humans and chimps split about 6 million years ago.
Although there's no fossil evidence of that period of separation.
You know, except for Sahelanthropus chadensis. But even accepting this, that estimation is primarily based on genetic molecular clock data, not fossils. So basically Dan is saying, yeah, people say the sky is blue, even though no one has any radio astronomy evidence of blue skies. Well, yeah, that wasn't really the basis on which the sky being blue was established.
So why are you saying it, that you think that? Why do you think that? What makes you think that when there's no evidence?
There is evidence based on known and measurable phylogenetic replacement rates and the well-sequenced genome of both Pan-troglodytes and Homo sapiens. Basically, we can measure about how fast mutations accumulate in a population, then use the genetic similarity of chimps and humans to measure how long that amount of difference would take to accumulate, and you get about 6 million years.
Richard Leakey said he thinks that there's more evidence for humans appearing quickly than gradually.
Maybe that was reasonable 30 years ago, but we've come a long way. Check out these skulls, just for example.
This is Stephen Jay Gould. He's a famous evolutionist.
I'm not going to argue about what a man said in a book from more than 4 decades ago. Until Pete makes a point that isn't just quote-mining Stephen Jay Gould, we're skipping ahead. Oh, after, he also gives us a quote from someone else without a citation. So I don't even know if it's real, but since Pete won't give me a reason to think it is, I'll just assume it's not.
Here's some other inconsistencies.
Other? Bold to assume there have been any so far.
Second law of thermodynamics says everything's running down, not getting better.
No, it says that the amount of energy unavailable to do work in a technical physical sense will tend to increase or stay the same in an isolated system. Or that the number of quantum microstates that will be measured as the current macrostate of an isolated system will tend to increase or stay the same. The degree to which this corresponds to a human understanding of order is meaningless to nature.
All living things came from living things.
Sure, today maybe, but that's not a guarantee that it was always the case. And besides, he thinks Adam was made from a bunch of rock, not really a living thing. So I'm not sure why he's bothering making a point even he thinks is not true. For the first time with this one, I'm tending to lean towards maybe he's not just ignorant. Maybe he knows better, but I'm not there yet.
Is the law of abiogenesis? We've never seen an exception to it. It's a law.
It's not a law, it's a general principle about modern life.
Evolution violates that. Cell theory is violated, that all living things are composed of cells.
Cell theory is about modern life, not all possible or all past life.
And cells come only from other cells.
Now.
Evolution violates that.
No.
That for every effect, like the universe, there's a cause that's bigger than the effect. That would be God that created the universe would have to be bigger than the universe. And he is.
You sure that's not nothing? Because I'm pretty sure that's nothing.
So violates all of these other well-respected laws and theories of science.
It doesn't violate 3 of the 4, and the one it does violate isn't found anywhere in science, so Pete is 0 for 4.
So DNA is an extremely intricate information system that shows there has to be a purposeful intelligence to produce such an elegant system. So this is an old slide. We only had 340 gigabytes of memory back then, and we're way past that. But if you consider that that's what man's best effort at that time had produced that, and we thought we were really something. And somebody said, well, what about DNA? It's a little bit more compact than that. Well, how much? 5 billion times more compact than that. And so it's still billions of times more compact than anything we've ever come up with. They studied DNA to try to figure out how to get more compact systems. DNA is the area of research right now that if you're not up with it, it's exploding the knowledge of DNA, and all of it makes the evolutionary explanation become lower and lower and lower.
DNA is compact, therefore it can't evolve is a weird take, given that we can see it evolve.
Multifunctional genes, with another part of it that used to be junk DNA, when it turns on, it makes this gene code for something else.
Wait, is he arguing that neo-functionalization of junk DNA is a problem for evolution rather than an example of it?
And then another part of what used to be junk DNA would turn the same part and it'll code for something else. We're finding all this stuff out now. It's mind-blowing, and yet they still want to explain it away.
Okay, I feel like I must not be understanding his point, because it really, really sounds like he's saying that junk DNA mutating to become a gene promoter, which then establishes a new function, isn't evolution. But that really, really sounds like a cool example of evolution, not a reason evolution isn't real. If you think you know what he means, please let me know in the comments.
Since the density and complexity of the DNA encoded information is billions of times greater than man's present technology, we can conclude the coder of the DNA must be supremely intelligent.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
Okay, and is that a logical conclusion? I call that a logical conclusion.
Well, no one is going to accuse Pete Greer of being a follower of Sirach of Vulcan.
So evolution requires the addition of new genetic information. We have never seen the addition of new genetic information.
For which we still have no definition.
For our cousins, they call us, we're 3% different. Look how similar we are. We're only 3% different.
More like 1.2% different in alignable regions.
Well, the newest research has made it more like 30%.
Citation needed, amigo. I've never heard of a figure that high, even from that hack Tompkins, the only young Earth creationist I know of who's even trying to measure such things. And who got it wrong once because of a bad computer program, and then again because he forgot how to do basic high school arithmetic. Even he comes up with a difference about half of what Pete just reported here. I now think he's just lying. He didn't get that number from anywhere. He made it up, I'm fairly confident. I'd be happy to be wrong about it, but right now, the preponderance of the evidence is that Pete is a liar. If he happens to watch this and would like to dispute that, he's welcome to come on the channel.
Okay, so you can multiply this next figure by 10. That's 90 million differences in our DNA code. We haven't had enough time for that to happen since we supposedly diverged from our common ancestor.
Okay, so the human genome is about 6.4 billion base pairs long. Using the real numbers, not Pete's made-up ones, we get 76,800,000, but we need to divide that in half since it's chimps evolving too. So we get 38,400,000 differences between humans and chimps. So his numbers are off, but why is that number impossible?
So it's really 900 million differences, because we found out that when they made that comparison, they only took the parts that were similar, they didn't take the parts that were different. So it was skewed from the beginning. Surprise, surprise.
No, it's not 10 times higher. He means alignable, and the non-alignable regions are so because they are not sequence constrained, so they tend to have a higher accumulation rate, which is why they're non-alignable. And why are these sequences not constrained? Oh, because they are, by and large, not functional.
Another illusion based on false things. There's no spiral there. Those are all circles. Humans are not Humans are a special creation, not a product of evolution. This is my last one for today, and it's the most important one for especially our young people to understand. That we are on the planet of the humans who believe they are related to apes.
Apes are mammals with very flexible shoulders, enclosed orbits, hands with opposable thumbs and flat nails instead of claws, nostrils that do not diverge, no tails, tricuspid molars, and enlarged brains. Seems like humans are in fact apes. Pete is welcome to try to formulate a definition of ape that doesn't include human and that doesn't rely on special pleading. Good luck to him. But I don't think he'll even attempt to do so.
If only it was science fiction. No. How do we believe that? Well, you go to any museum and they'll teach you that. This says we belong to the ape family. Why is that? Because we're a vertebrate. Well, you know, they believe I'm related to a tree too, even though it's not a vertebrate. But anyway.
Yeah, but both a tree and a human are eukaryotes, so point still stands.
That foot on the ape, their feet don't look like that. They're like that, just like their hands.
Their feet are just hands.
They got a gripping thing, that's correct.
A divergent big toe. But the actual degree of divergence in modern apes varies, and it also varies in fossil hominins, so I'm not sure how useful that is as a diagnostic feature of apes.
And so they put it next to the human, and then you're supposed to say, oh, look it, we're so similar. Obviously, that's my grandpa.
Pete got it right that it was cousin earlier, so why is he switching to ancestor now? Only reason I can think of is dishonesty. So while it took a long time for me to get there, I am now going to have to treat Pete as a dishonest actor, as that is where the preponderance of the evidence has unfortunately led me.
Well, this is what they actually found of Lucy, who's still the biggest one, you know.
Lucy certainly isn't the biggest or most complete hominin fossil found, so I don't even know what he's getting at. She is important for reasons to do with the history of science, but at this point, even if her existence were erased and all measurements based on her with her, it wouldn't really change anything because we now have so many other specimens.
And they say that we evolved from Lucy, and this is our ancestor.
Not really. She represents an anatomy that there's no reason to think ever existed if humans and other apes do not share common ancestry, but she herself isn't likely to have been ancestral to modern humans.
And that's what they found. So, they take that, and what do they put in the museum for you to see? That. This is in St. Louis. A thinking, it's got a thought frozen in time. You can see it. You can see the whites of her eyes. You can't see that in those other two pictures I showed you. And a human hand. Okay? Everything there is modified to dumb down humans a little bit and lift apes up a little bit. So you think that you came from that.
Nope, it's based not just on Lucy, but on the hundreds of other specimens of her kind that we found. And while no one saw her eye whites, white sclerae occur in all ape species.
That's in St. Louis. It's in the St. Louis Zoo. And remember, there was no hands or feet found.
On Lucy? No. On other Australopithecus finds? Yes.
But we have found hands and feet now of that kind of ape. Guess what? That, not human.
Wrong. The Dakika child, which has one of the most complete fossil feet of any Australopithecine, shows no significant divergence of the first metatarsal. Now, that doesn't mean Australopithecus feet were exactly like modern human feet. They likely were not. But they also were not simply chimpanzee feet, which, is rather what you would expect if chimpanzees and humans shared a common ancestor.
Grasping, okay? So David Minton says, the purpose of this display is not for education, but for indoctrination in evolutionary theory.
David Minton was a creationist who thought that Velociraptor was just a bird and who died of some sudden illness during a pandemic while working for an anti-vax organization. He is not an authority on this subject.
See the human foot? Okay, so they said, hey, you know what? We found out that they don't have human feet or hands. They got locking wrists for knuckle walking.
Australopithecus did seem to have a locking wrist mechanism, although the overall anatomy precludes knuckle walking, with the angle of the knees, shape of the pelvis, angle of the foramen magnum, and overall proportions making them obligate bipeds. So what was the locking wrist for? I don't know. Maybe it was useful for climbing. Maybe it was simply vestigial. But it certainly doesn't make Lucy a knuckle walker.
Well, zoo officials have no plans to knuckle under, We cannot be updating every exhibit based on every new piece of evidence. We look at the overall exhibit and the impression it creates. We think the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct.
This is apparently from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, July 22, 1996 edition. I have no way to check up on this at this time from the primary source. The only other place I can find it is Creationist websites. Given their tendency to simply steal quotes from each other and misattribute them, I have no idea what to do with this quote, what the actual context was, or what Bruce Carr was really meaning.
So we're going to parade all your school children past this exhibit and let them think that this had human hands and feet so that they'll believe that they came from that or are related to it. That's the impression that we want to display at this museum.
It's the impression that's basically correct.
We don't want to display what's actually scientifically found. We want to create this impression. This agrees with our impression.
It does broadly reflect what was found, but assuming that Carr was not being misquoted, he runs a zoo, not a paleoanthropology department. I believe him when he says he can't update display models every time some new thing comes out, so even though the feet are too human-like, they're not really much more human-like than is appropriate. And yeah, it would be quite the hassle to have to remake a model every time some new measurement, like a scapular angle, comes out or something. The Ark Encounter certainly isn't going around updating their animals based on new findings.
This is in the Creation Museum, which is 40 miles from that Ark that they built in Kentucky. And it's got a hologram of the bones with the dimensions and the size.
No, with wrong dimensions and an impossible pelvis.
And everything else of Lucy's bones. And so, you know, right now it's just got the arm. You press another button and the leg, and legs will show up and everything. But Lucy was about 4 foot tall, was definitely a knuckle-walking Australopithecus ape.
Friend of the channel Gutsick Gibbon has covered this better than I could, so here's a link to her coverage of this.
The Bible tells us that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. But will our kids ever learn that?
Yeah, they will, assuming kids go to this church and listen to sermons they just heard it. School teachers aren't the only source for kids to learn from. Here's a fun example. You ever hear a very small child curse? Yeah, chances are they didn't learn that from the school teacher.
Going to public school? No, they can't hear creation, see creation, or speak about the Creator. They're actually, in many places, not everywhere. We got some good Christian teachers here in Payson. I don't think would do that. But in many places, they do that. When I retired from the high school,
students in the United States are not barred from talking about God, religion, or creation. However, they can and should be told not to interrupt class with that when it's not the subject of class. We can't have a science class that gets interrupted by unsubstantiated no-ohs from students.
They do that. When I retired from the high school, there was a guy who was a young earth creationist who went in there, and I felt good about that. He quit after a year and a half, and this totally evolutionary person came in and would actually dock people points, is what one parent told me, if they spoke about it or tried to get extra credit for doing a creation-related project.
Giving a student extra credit or even full credit for spouting young earth creationism in science class is about as reasonable as giving someone full credit or extra credit for promoting flat earth in geography class.
I've had several students from high school come back and tell me my professor ridiculed me when I told him I believed the Bible. That's what's happening in our education system. That's why our youth are so confused and out there doing what they're doing in our culture today.
It was not my experience that people in college were ridiculed for believing the Bible. If that is happening, it absolutely should not, and if a documented case of that is brought to my attention, I will absolutely call it out and try to bring what attention to it I can. But on the other hand, if you believe demonstrably and absurdly wrong things about the basic reality we live in, like a flat or a young Earth, then being ridiculed for that isn't ideal, but it's also not surprising. Maybe Mr. Greer should just stop lying to convince children of absurd nonsense.
Because evolution, if you take it into your heart, is dangerous. I told my homeschool students when I taught them for 2 years, have it in your head, know it really well, but it doesn't go to your heart.
Two things. One, I can't imagine what it would mean to have evolution in your heart. Like, no one worships evolution or looks to it for guidance, except about, change in reproducing populations over time. Two, I don't think that Pete Greer is capable of teaching children to know evolution really well, because if this sermon is anything to go by, he clearly doesn't know it very well himself. In fact, I knew it better than he does when I was in high school.
The Bible's what it believes is what's in your heart. Don't swallow it. Because then you'll learn things like this, that there's superior races.
That chart depicts a separate ancestry model in which humans evolved separately from earlier hominins in different parts of the globe. So the idea would be that, say, the Chinese people evolved from Chinese Homo erectus, while perhaps Europeans evolved from H. neanderthalensis, and maybe Africans from H. heidelbergensis. Now, this idea doesn't have to be racist, but its proponents usually were. But the thing is that this hasn't been in favor basically since Darwin, and its last proponents, who were in China, as far as I know, gave it up after DNA testing of local H. erectus specimens showed that the people of China were far closer to other H. sapiens individuals than they were to the local extinct H. erectus populations. In fact, it is evolutionary biology and population genetics that have demonstrated that at the genetic level, humans do not have separate races, and that the overt differences in eye, hair, and skin color and face shape that humans use to categorize each other into races are extremely superficial, and that under the skin, humans are all fundamentally similar, more so than many species.
And then people that believe that do things like this, dig up graves and send them to museums for profit.
Yeah, it's a big problem with archaeology as to whether you're grave robbing versus when you were doing legitimate archaeology. That's why nowadays archaeology has strict ethical guidelines and legal requirements. But also the slide on screen is about something far worse than grave robbing, so let's see if he talks about that.
I mean, this is just, I've got all kinds of examples on the illusion of human evolution talk that I gave.
Nope, I guess we're going to ignore that top-billed article about people being murdered in favor of grave desecration. Neither is okay, but I feel like murder is worse.
These guys all either believed were fans of Darwin or people who did what Darwin said.
No, we're not going to have guilt from association. Even if all the most evil people in the world accepted evolution, that wouldn't make it true or false.
So the Human Genome Project verified that. We found out that there's only 0.2 of 1% difference between any two people. So we're 99.8% similar. The most diverse people on the planet are 0.2% different.
Right, and that's what those kids Pete is so worried about are going to learn in school, because that's what the science is. So all this talk about learning about racism because of evolution is nonsense, and he's telling us here.
What about what we call racial characteristics? 0.012 of 1%, 12 thousandths of a percent different. There are no races. We're all humankind.
Hey, Pete and I agree on something. That's nice.
Going back to that quote from Gould, all of that racial stuff is just our culture. It's not anything to do with actually being different biologically. We're all one race.
So who thinks he's about to be balanced and fair and go into all the biblical passages that were used to defend slavery and racism, like the curse of Ham, for example? I'm not holding my breath. I'll just say that while the history of evolutionary biology is full of racists, the history of Bible-believing Christians is also full of racists. And while I'm not going to get into a Richard measuring contest over who is the worst racist in history, I'll just say that pointing out past racism in science as a reason to reject it without pointing out the historical and present problems with racism in your own camp is intellectually dishonest. After this, he goes on about how Christians shouldn't marry or date non-Christians. I don't care what Christians do with their dating lives as long as it's consensual all around. After that, it's just preaching and telling people that if they aren't Christians, it's because they know better, but then decided not to, then God confused them or something like that. And then that's it. He's done arguing about science and spends the rest of his time on exegetical stuff and telling us which creationist websites he thinks are trustworthy. Well, thank you for coming on this journey with me. I set out with this series to hear what John Q. Public Creationist hears coming from the stage, I guess? Side note, if someone knows the name for the raised part of a Protestant church, let me know. I know Catholics and Orthodox call that the sanctuary, but as far as I know, Protestants use that for the whole room, including what those churches would call the nave. Anyway, if this is anything to go by, then on the ground in church, creationism hasn't progressed much past Canthovind, which might explain why he still has a following despite being so wrong about so much that even other creationists call him out on it. Or at least they did before it became clear that, independent of his inane takes on science, he's also a reprehensible piece of shit who beats his wives and children, keeps the company of sex offenders whose victims were children, and who, despite saying that homosexuals should be executed, may just be engaging in some naughtiness on that front. I find that to be rather sad, but I guess I'm not really surprised. Well, if you stuck with me this long, thank you very much. Please remember to do all the YouTube stuff such as liking the video, commenting, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you're always notified when I have new content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a moment to thank all my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above: Ben Tovand, Denny5252, Ian Chen, John Ackerman, Chris Love, Landon Knoll, Sphincter of Doom, Star Runner, and Patrick Dennis. It's because of my channel members and patrons that this channel can keep on going at the blistering pace of 2 to 3 and almost always 3 uploads per week. And because I do run this channel at a slight loss, it is very important that anyone who can afford to and really likes my content, please do consider joining the Patreon or joining the channel with the link below. Patreon link is in the description. On Patreon, you can join at a 10% discount if you join for an annual subscription. And if for some reason you can't afford it, or an annual or monthly pledge isn't for you, there are always other ways to help out the channel. There's an Amazon wishlist linked in the description. There's also a merch store full of almost everything that Teespring makes.